the ramstrots we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets were clear, the boats bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, saints of that star-spangled banner yet wave, for the land of the free and the home of the brave.
Thank you, Ms. Priestley. I have a few announcements before I'm not going to make any announcements until you quiet down. Town meeting is now in session. Please take your seats and be silent. Thank you. First, I ask you to please silence your cell phones as usual. I remind you of our seating procedures. Town meeting members only forward of the barriers, except for town staff and non-town meeting member speakers. The front row is dedicated to the press on my right and to handicapped persons anywhere in the front row. I remind all speakers to announce your name and precinct at the beginning of your presentation. And as opposed to most town meetings, we have different time limits that apply to this one. Presenters will have 5 minutes and all others will have 3 minutes to present, absent special dispensation from the moderator. I remind you to address questions to the moderator when we have a Q&A session. Now, we will take the articles in the order in which they appear in the main STM1 town meeting, with the following exceptions. We'll take Articles 26 to 28, dealing with the renaming of the Coolidge Corner School, first thing tomorrow evening, and immediately thereafter, if we conclude those articles, we will deal with Article 21. However, I need a motion to, thank you, is there a second? All in favor of moving Articles 26 and 28 to first thing Wednesday and then to be followed by Article 21, please say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. Motion carries by unanimous vote. Secondly, due to their universal importance, we will hear my recommendation, is that we deal with the special town meeting 3 articles relating to marijuana establishments first thing Thursday evening, and immediately thereafter the special town meeting 2 article dealing with the lowering of the voting age in municipal elections. Is there a motion to that effect? Second. All in favor, please say aye. Those opposed, no. Motion carries unanimously. Next, there are some articles that are either paired with others or related to others that suggest that we should have combined debates. And certainly Articles 22 and 23, which relate to leaf blowers, are 2 of them. 26 to 28, we will have a combined debate. And also in the last 3 articles in the first special town meeting, 32 through 34, which all of which deal with bylaw terminology. We will have a single debate for those. Finally, we'll debate all of the marijuana establishment articles in a single debate. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we are in for a long, long warrant that I hope we can finish in 4 evenings. In fact, I'll do my best to make sure that that happens. There are a lot of issues that will come before you that are controversial and that have created considerable controversy among town meeting members and among those who will address each side of those issues. In view of that, I want to remind you that we have pretty strict rules about civility in town meeting, and for better or for worse, I'm charged with enforcing those rules and will do so. I occasionally read an invocation, shall we say, from a small town meeting, moderator of a small town meeting in Vermont that I think is relevant to what I hope we can accomplish at this town meeting. It goes as follows. We've come together in civil assembly as a community in a tradition that is as old as our state itself. We come together to make decisions about our community. As we deliberate, let us advocate for our positions, but not at the expense of others. Let us remember that there's an immense gap between saying, I'm right, and saying, I believe that I'm right, and that our neighbors with whom we disagree are good people with hopes and dreams as true and as high as ours. And let us always remember that in the end, caring for each other in this community is of far greater importance than any differences that we may have. Welcome to town meeting. We'll now have a test vote to test our handheld devices. The resolution before you is resolved that Washington Street should be renamed. And when the voting period has already started, so press 1 if you agree with that resolution, press 2 if you are opposed to it, press 3 if you want to abstain or don't care. And please pay attention to the scrolling through the town meeting members to make sure that your vote has been recorded. Okay, we'll scroll through one more time. Yes. I'm sorry I didn't remind you of this, but if your vote was not recorded, it is in all likelihood because you didn't turn on your device, and you do that with the button in the lower right-hand corner. It's an O, a circle with a vertical dash through it.
Mr. Moderator?
Yes, Mr. Burstein.
Michael Burstein, Precinct 12. I don't know if this is a point of order information or what. I was testing my device before town meeting. I turned it on, and it automatically went off. Are these new devices? Are they going off automatically now?
Okay,
Thank you, sir.
Every time we have an electronic vote, you should first turn your device on before you vote. Okay, let the games begin. We turn to Article 1, which provides for the payment of bills of prior years. There being no such bills before us, the vote is for no action by Mr. Fernandez and seconded by Mr. Doughty. All those in favor of a no action vote on Article 1, please say aye. Those opposed, no. Motion carries unanimously. Article 2 relates to collective bargaining agreements. Again, there are no such agreements before us. And no action is moved by Mr. Fernandez, seconded by Mr. Sandman. All those in favor of no action on Article 2, please say aye. Those opposed, no. Motion carries unanimously. Article 3. The main motion and only motion under Article 3 is on page 3-8 to amend the FY20 budget as shown in the table, and I call on Ms. Benka. It's moved by Ms. Benka and seconded by Mr. Green.
Good evening. I'm Carla Benka, town meeting member from Precinct 13, speaking for the Advisory Committee. Article 3 asks town meeting to vote on several amendments to the fiscal 2020 budget. First is a change to the debt service budget. Because last May's override vote failed, interest payments for the purchase of the Oak Street townhouses, part of the Baldwin School project, cannot be covered by override votes, but will instead be paid for by contingency provisions in the tax levy. As a result, Article 3 reduces the debt service line item in the fiscal 20 budget by $140,217. The second adjustment is to allocate an additional $76,789 in state aid. Article 3 directs a small portion of that money to DPW to cover the costs of composting activities in the public schools, and evenly divides the remaining amount between the town and the schools. The town share, which equals $30,895, would go to the fire department for its operating budget, while the school department plans to use its share to reduce its ongoing structural deficit. A third adjustment is to transfer $234,757 from the Transportation Network Company Special Revenue Account. Those are the funds that reflects the town's share of the state's assessment on Uber and Lyft, and allocate those dollars as recommended by the town's Transportation Board. 50% of the total, or $117,757, would be used to partially fund the Olmsted Bridle Path Restoration Study and Concept Design Project, the total cost of which is currently estimated at $200,000. The remaining dollars would be used to increase access to transportation services for Brookline seniors and to purchase and place benches at designated bus stops and along Harvard and Washington streets for pedestrian seating. The last budget adjustment involves the distribution of $867,660 in community impact funds, part of the town's host community agreement with NETA. State regulations limit this money to funding costs incurred by municipalities related to the operation of marijuana establishments. Article 3 proposes directing these community impact funds to 1, support police overtime and additional police personnel for enforcement and inspections, 2, to cover DPW's costs of additional litter control, 3, to compensate DPW's Parks and Open Space Division for additional park ranger hours dedicated to enforcing public park regulations, and 4, to fund various positions in the health department, including substance abuse counselors. The advisory committee has also recommended and is pleased that the select board and its staff endorse using $80,000 of the impact funds to create an ombudsperson position within the select board's office. As envisioned by the advisory committee, this individual's responsibilities would include managing communications between the town and affected neighbors and neighborhoods, coordinating and overseeing mitigation efforts, and collecting data necessary to evaluate licensing issues. It should be noted that the town's agreement regarding community impact fees lasts for only 5 years, and that an extension of the agreement would need to be negotiated. It should also be noted that these measures should they be approved by town meeting, are likely to continue to be refined as the fiscal '21 operating budget is developed. A unanimous advisory committee recommends favorable action on the budget adjustments found in the table on page 3-8 and the amended tables 1 and 2 that follow, and by a vote of 24-01, the advisory committee recommends favorable action on the transfer of $234,757 from the Transportation Network Company's special revenue account to implement the recommendations of the Transportation Board. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Green. Mr. Milner-Bragg, would you come forward, please?
Good evening, Mr. Moderator and town meeting members. Bernard Green for the Select Board. Before I begin, I want to shout out Representative Tommy Vitolo and Nika Elgardo in the back there. We appreciate your attendance here at town meeting, and especially appreciate the fact that Representative Elgardo is here, since only Precinct 5 is in her district, yet she is committed to Brookline as a whole, and that's really appreciated. So Warrant Article 3 is a supplemental appropriation for the fiscal year 2020 budget for additional funds that have been made available after the May budget vote. After the budget was voted in May, the town began to receive community impact funds, among other things, under the NETA Host Community Agreement. This amount was 3% of gross revenue. The use of these funds is strictly limited to the Cannabis Control Commission to costs reasonably related to the cost imposed on the community by the cannabis business. This money went into the town's coffers, but we could not use it because it had not been appropriated by town meeting. This summer, neighbors of NETA voiced concerns and complaints about public consumption, litter, excessive parking on public streets, traffic violations, and other violations of law and quality of life. They attributed these problems to NETA. Some of them were, some of them weren't. The Select Board also was criticized for not quickly spending the unappropriated funds from the Host Community Agreement. In response, we asked the town administrator to use, on a temporary basis, $40,000 already appropriated but not yet spent in the police and DPW budgets to cover services to address community concerns. This money was used for police overtime to support a dedicated bicycle unit and other police patrols, for parking enforcement, for a dedicated DPW litter crew, for the acquisition and installation of additional what are called big belly trash receptacles and also compactors, and for additional park ranger coverage. Separately, the appropriation of monies from the Host Community Agreement equals $867,660. This money is proposed to be allocated among the police, DPW, the health department, the Select Board, and fringe benefits for new full-time equivalent employees and other overhead expenses. The appropriation to the Select Board was added by an advisory committee amendment that Ms. Banker mentioned that transferred funds originally allocated to the health department for public health outreach. The advisory committee wanted those funds for an ombudsman-type position for marijuana complaints. The Select Board was willing to fund such a position, and we will hire that person in the next few weeks, we believe. We expect to restore funding for the health department from future Host Community Agreement funds. We are currently calling this position a Community Impact Coordinator. This will be an administrative position within the Town Administrator Select Board office to serve as a single point of contact for the public and to coordinate the town's response to complaints. As conceived by the Select Board, this person will be responsible for cannabis issues only. More detail on the uses of this Host Community Agreement appropriation can be found on pages 3-4 to 3-7 of your combined reports materials under the narratives of the Select Board and the Advisory Committee. I wanted to focus on that because for the Select Board, that money has been a hot-button issue for us in the community. But in addition to the host community agreement appropriation, other items being addressed in this budget and that Ms. Benka elaborated in greater detail than I will, are additional state aid of $79,121 divided among the Sanitation Division for public school composting, and the balance divided between the schools and the town, each receiving $30,895, the detail of which Ms. Benka provided. Shifting the debt service, which remains interest only for the bond anticipation note issued to purchase the Oak Street properties from the Capital Improvement Program budget to the general fund, which has the capacity to absorb this expense. And 3, using the Transportation Network Company's money, which is the fee we get from Uber and Lyft rides, which comes from the state in the amount of $234,757 for elder transportation, bus stop amenities, and concept design for the Bridle Path proposal along the Beacon Street MBTA tracks. On October 29th, the Select Board voted favorable action on the motion of the Advisory Committee, which transferred the $80,000 to the Select Board office from the Health Department to the Select Board. Unanimous favorable action by the Select Board. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Milner-Bragg.
Can I just speak from the microphone?
Certainly.
Yes, Jules Milner-Braggi, Town Meeting Member, Precinct 12. Just wanted to speak specifically about item C, which is the appropriation of the Uber and Lyft impact fees meant to mitigate the impact of those vehicles and their use in our town. And I just wanted to say, first off, this is something that was broadly supported and endorsed by the Green Caucus, and I personally wanted to thank town staff and the Transportation Board and its advisory committees, along with a variety of community groups, for preparing a multimodal, a multi-age collection of things. This is something that is going to help folks to contemplate how we can effectively retire from driving when we wish to get additional support for travel to and from appointments if you need that additional medical assistance, to have seating that's beneficial for bus stops and folks walking along major walking corridors, and to support a portion of the money for the feasibility study and concept design of Beacon Bridle Way that will hopefully be filled and we'll get a proposal for in May. So that's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. On the motion,
Moderator, may I have a question?
Yes, Mr. Franco.
Mr. Moderator, Jim Franco, Town Meeting Member from Precinct 1. I have questions about the impact fees from NETA. It's my understanding that the town administrator proposed and the Select Board accepted funds of $40,000, which were $21,000 for police and $19,000 for DPW. I want to make sure that, I want to know if those funds have been implemented, that is, if we're using those funds from the date of approval, which was, I think, October 6th. And I also want to know if there's any data, assuming those funds have been expended, if there's any data about what the effect has been before and after the expenditure of these funds. And then I have another question after that.
Mr. Kleckner, well, I don't believe that we can expend any of those funds until town meeting appropriates them, and that's what we're doing this evening. Mr. Kleckner?
Good evening, Mel Kleckner, Town Administrator. So back in early October, when, as a Select Board member and Chair Green mentioned, there was a lot of pressure on the Select Board to spend these monies that we actually had in our coffers, but couldn't expend because it needs to be appropriated by town meeting. We were considering whether to go to the reserve, to the advisory committee for a reserve fund, but what we decided to do was instruct the departments, the DPW and the police department, to expend from their existing budget, the budget you approved last spring for this current fiscal year, with the expectation that we would have this appropriation tonight that would go back into their budget. So we did that back on October I believe the select board approved that on October 5th, and we, the next day, instructed those departments to allocate that sum of money in their budget to do the things that we talked about. Police patrols, parking enforcement, park patrols, litter enforcement, and so on. I don't have all the numbers, but our two departments, the main departments, the DPW director, commissioner, and the police chief is here to talk about some of the activity that they've been doing and to give you a sense of how it's worked. If
You had another question, Mr. Franco?
The second question was, Mr. Christ raised on the town meeting listserv earlier today the possibility of finding a place for Uber and Lyft vehicles to park. You know, at the airport, they have a pooling arrangement. With technology, it should be able to, I think the village is a hotspot with or without NETA. I'm wondering if the town has reached out to those transportation network services to see if that could be implemented.
Mr.
Thank you.
Kleckner?
The question was whether we have reached out to Uber and Lyft to adjust the pickup and drop-off locations, and my understanding is we have, and they've changed the PIN, I'm told, to a location on Boylston Street.
Thank you. Mr. Rosenthal?
Yes, thank you. Marty Rosenthal, Precinct 9. I'm also Chair of PAX. My question is actually related to the one that Mr. Franco just asked, and I'd just like to follow it up then with this, which is, can either Mr. Kleckner, Mr. Green, or I see Chief Lipson here ready to speak tonight, answer whether or not it's felt that this transfer and the procedures, the targets that are in the combined reports that are listed for us, is that adequate to deal with the safety issues that we've been hearing about right now? Or alternatively, I guess, there would have been an effort to transfer more money from the reserve fund.
Chief Lipson? Or, yeah.
Good evening, Andrew Lipson, Chief of Police. Mr. Rosenthal, it's an evolving situation. We've implemented the funds that we've been granted, and we'll continue to monitor and adjust accordingly.
And may I follow up with a briefly?
Sure.
And is it fair to say that if you felt you need more resources, you would ask for it and not wait for May?
Yes.
I'm quite sure he would. Okay, on the motion on page 3-8, which includes, by the way, the revised budget charts on the next few pages, those in favor, please say aye. Those opposed, no. Motion carries unanimously. Motion carries 207 to 1. Thank you for the correction. Article 4. Listen carefully. The main motion under Article 4 is that of the petitioner on page 1 of the rose-colored supplement at the top of that page. It's moved by Mr. Ananian, seconded by Ms. McClellan. There is a motion by, two motions by Mr. Van Scoyoc. Well, actually before we get to these, I need to deal with Mr. Lowy's motion to divide the question. And that, what that means is that we will vote separately, if this motion passes, on the whether or not the words fossil fuel free should be included in the fourth line of the main motion, as they are in the one on the, before you on the rose-colored supplement. So Mr. Lowy moves to divide the question to deal with, vote on that issue separately. Is there a second? All those in favor, please say aye. Those opposed, no. That motion carries, I think, unanimously. So we have before us the main motion of Mr. Ananian. There will be two motions by Mr. Van Scoyac, seconded by Mr. Sandman in the first instance and Ms. Hamilton in the second. The first, to delete the words fossil fuel free from the main motion. The second, to do two things: change the amount of the appropriation from $115,300,000 to $108,800,000, and to insert in Mr. Ananian's motion the portion of the motion that's has a strikes through it, and the version that's redlined against the advisory committee motion. So if you look in the second paragraph on page 1 of that supplement, you will see a repetition of the vote with the changes from the advisory committee motion underlined or stricken. And it's that phrase, including the evaluation of the feasibility of providing office space for district-wide staff of the Brookline Public Schools, that you will be voting in the second of Mr. Van Scoyac's motions to insert into the main motion. And finally, we will have the motion of Mr. Friedman to change the amount from whatever wound up as the amount in the main motion as a result of the third motion that I just described, whether it's 115.3 or 108.8. Mr. Friedman would reduce that to $98 million. So we will have a main motion and 3 amendments. And when we get through either amending or not amending the main motion, we will then vote on the main motion as amended or not, and in a final vote, and that vote requires a 2/3 vote. So I'll go through this again when we reach the point at which we will start to vote on these motions, and hope that it will be adequately clear to all of you. It has been published over the TMMA listserv for whatever benefit that might be. So I call on Mr. Ananian. You have 10 minutes, sir.
Could I have my slides, please? Thanks. Yeah. Okay, while we wait for them to come up, I'll introduce myself. Good evening. My name is Scott Ananian. I'm a town meeting member from Precinct 10, and I have the great honor to present Warrant Article 4 to you first tonight. It's indeed an honor because it's not my work. It's the culmination of work by the Driscoll Building Committee, School Committee, Advisory Board, Select Boards past and present, who all have been working on this project in one form or another since June 13 of 2018. And of course, before what you're working on. Okay, well, before I leave this slide, which you can't see, which lists all the co-petitioners on this motion, I'll also take the opportunity to thank the spouses and families who've helped out to make this possible. Behind all the folks who are working on it, or all the other folks who, who've been sacrificing a lot. And since I seem to have a little bit of time, I'll say my wife and kids are in the back too, so thank you.
I won't count this time against you, Mr. Ananian.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I'm sure, like with the voting, my being a guinea pig will make this work more smoothly for everyone else, I hope.
Don't feel that you have to ad lib, sir. Looks as if you're going to have to make your presentation without a PowerPoint presentation, Mr. Nady, I'm sorry about that. But the system is not working right now.
Mr. Moderator,
Yes.
point of order. Could we take Article 5 first while they work this out and then come back to Article 4?
Is there some possibility of working this out?
Thank you.
That's an excellent suggestion, and I'll take it. Mr. Nanian, you can stand down,
Thank you.
and we'll proceed to Article 5 and go through successive articles until our IT staff has worked out the problem. So, Article 5, the motion is on page 5-5 over to page 5-6. It's moved by Mr. Wyszynski and seconded by Mr. Brown. There is a little bit of a wording change, and the motion starts about 2/3 of the way down page 5-5, and it should read, instead of that, the town will vote to authorize, should simply read voted to authorize the select board, etc. And the motion is to sell, lease, or otherwise dispose of the Oak Street property that you've heard so much about. It's moved by Mr. Wyszynski and seconded by Mr. Brown, and I call on Ms. Nobrega, the petitioner. This will require a 2/3 vote. You have 5 minutes.
Mariah Nobrega, town meeting member from Precinct 4 and Advisory Committee, not speaking on behalf of Advisory Committee, but speaking in support of Warrant Article 5 on behalf of the petitioners. Warrant Article 5 would authorize the Select Board to sell the 3 Oak Street townhouses that were acquired as part of the plan to build a 9th school at Baldwin. This warrant article was submitted twice for the fall town meeting, once by the petitioners, who are myself, former Select Board Chair Neil Wyszynski, and current Select Board member Ben Franco, and once by the Select Board, who subsequently withdrew their duplicate article. This is not being foisted upon the Select Board by a bunch of radicals. In many ways, Warrant Article 5 is a housekeeping article. It seeks only to provide the authorization to sell if and when it makes sense to sell. Only town meeting is authorized to give the Select Board this power, and it is only an authorization, not a mandate. No matter how you feel about a night school project, you should vote yes on this warrant article. The key reason for this is that the warrant article will allow the Select Board to move expeditiously when needed, rather than having to seek authorization later in a rush from town meeting. We all know the words town meeting and rush do not go well together. The requested authorization will provide the Select Board with flexibility to, for example, sell to avoid losing money on the property. I want to note that in just a couple of years, when we begin to pay the principal on the loan, the debt service will outstrip the rents by a significant amount. Advisory has done substantial analysis of this point and will present it later. The requested authorization will also provide the Select Board with flexibility to sell these properties to instead address future capital needs. For example, for land acquisition for a 9th school, be it at Newbury or elsewhere. Again, it's all about enabling the Select Board to act if and when it makes sense. The purchase of these townhouses made sense last fall in the context of the Baldwin project. It doesn't make sense, with that project no longer viable, to force the town to act as a landlord in perpetuity. Warrant Article 5 is important for our capital planning needs, and I urge you to vote favorable action.
Thank you, Mr. Glover.
Good evening, Michael Glover on behalf of the school committee. I'm here actually on behalf of a majority of the school committee to encourage you all to vote no action on warrant article 5. In thinking about this warrant article, it's important to think about the Oak Street parcels beyond the context of the most recent debate on the Baldwin project. I think that if you do, you will see that authorizing the sale of the Oak Street parcels doesn't make sense strategically. Even if we assume that there is no need for a school at the Baldwin site at this time, or that the Baldwin site is a poor location for a school at this time, we cannot be sure that this will be the case in 25, 50, or 100 years from now. The needs of the town and the characteristics of this location are going to change. It is reasonable to assume that the population in Brookline will increase over the next century to a level that will require more school buildings. And the Baldwin site could be a viable location for a school building at a later appropriate time. Alternatively, it is possible that there will be an appropriate non-school use for the site at some point in the next century. In either event, selling the Oak Street parcels would limit the flexibility of the town in making decisions about how to use the Baldwin site in the future. Obviously, it would make the area for redevelopment or reuse smaller, which would adversely impact decisions around programming, massing, zoning, etc. It's clear that the increased utility of the Oak Street parcels, when combined with the Baldwin site, makes the Oak Street parcels substantially more valuable to the town than the market value of the Oak Street parcels in isolation. This is particularly true given that useful land like this, that is adjacent to other town-owned property, is incredibly scarce and difficult to acquire. From a financial perspective, the cost impacts of the CIP that will be incurred if we retain the Oak Street parcels are relatively small and manageable. Moreover, if the apartments on Oak Street are rented, these impacts will likely diminish substantially over time as rents increase. When you consider the potential long-term utility of being able to combine the Oak Street parcels with the Baldwin site for some future use, any small impact on the CIP caused by retaining the parcels is clearly a worthwhile expense. As some of you may know, I live very close to the former Sewell School on Cypress Street in Precinct 5. It wasn't that long ago that well-meaning and intelligent town officials made the decision to sell that property instead of keeping it as a school building. At the time, folks must have felt that there would be no future need for the property. I believe they were wrong. The supporters of warrant Article 5 are similarly suggesting that there will be no future need for the Oak Street parcels. We can't possibly know what the town might decide to do with the Baldwin site in the future. But I think we can all agree that the reuse or redevelopment potential of that site is diminished if it doesn't include the Oak Street parcels. For that reason, and the fact that the financial impacts of retaining the parcels are minimal and manageable, I urge you all to vote no action on warrant Article 5. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Doggett.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Good evening, everybody. John Doggett, Precinct 13, and speaking for the Advisory Committee. Article 5 authorizes but does not require the Select Board to sell the Oak Street properties. The committee agreed that the Select Board should be given the authority to sell the properties. The discussion focused on whether the recommendation regarding the timing of the sale should be offered, and also whether a sunset provision should be added as an amendment. The committee noted that the financing of these properties is using interest payable only short-term debt, around about $147,000 a year, coming out of today's budget. It's assumed that this expense will rise to as much as $315,000 when the town is required to fully amortize the debt in 2021. The properties currently generate no tax revenue and only about $72,000 a year in rent. The expenses that the town has spent on the properties this year to date, about $30,000, so we're giving a project net rental income of only about $42,000. In addition, the properties were sold, if the properties were sold and put back onto the tax rolls, it would be considered new growth and would add an additional $45,000 of property tax revenue, which is an implicit additional cost of holding the property. Even when market rate rentals for the properties are implemented, it is unlikely that the properties will break even financially. The overall cost of carrying the properties, the amortization, and the loss of tax revenue has the effect of crowding out other projects in the CIP. A sunset clause amendment to the petitioner's motion excuse me, was considered by many members to be felt such a clause essentially withdraw such a clause to essentially withdraw the authorization to sell at a given time was counterproductive and would have unintended consequences. So the advisory committee voted 23-0 for favorable action on the petitioner's motion to sell the properties. I'd like to turn now to the resolution that you might have you've received today in your package. And because of the timing of this, and I'm sure many of you have not had the chance to read it, the advisory committee tonight considered this fact and basically voted for the a resolution, but as only advice to the select board and not to ask for a vote at town meeting. Let me briefly explain what the resolution is about. The members were concerned that the select board ought to be given more advice concerning timing of the transaction and wanted to sell the properties as soon as possible since the economics that I've talked about above. The main reason is that the immediate property disposal is to add back approximately $5 million of borrowing capacity and to lessen the demands on CIT projects and other large capital projects such as the Driscoll School rebuilding. The resolution does offer the select board an alternative. If the school committee and the school department want to keep the properties, they may do so, provided the entire net cost of carry of the properties is assumed by the school department's budget. Under this provision, if school department committee were to...
Excuse me, Mr. Doggett, you're over your time and the resolution is not before town meeting, so could you please conclude?
I will conclude, Mr. Moderator. The advisory committee voted 19-3 to 5 to adopt the resolution, advice to the select board to dispose of the Oak Street properties as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Franco?
Thank you, Mr. Moderator, and through you to the body. Ben Franco for a majority of the Select Board. Again, Article 5 asks town meeting to authorize the Select Board to, at a future date, sell the 3 condominiums the town purchased in December 2018. It's important, again, to note, and for this body to understand that passage of Article 5 does not require, encourage, or direct the Select Board to dispose of the 3 condos. The article simply authorizes the board to sell the properties at the right time and for the right amount of money. As we all know, the condos were acquired last year as part of the former plan to reconstruct the Baldwin School. A debt exclusion vote that would have enabled the Baldwin School project to proceed was put before the voters last May, and again, as we all know, it failed. Today, the Baldwin School project is dead due to a lack of funding and political support, and there's currently no town agreed-to plan that contemplates use of the Oak Street properties. You heard Mr. Glover, on behalf of the school committee, argue that because the Oak Street properties' proximity to the Baldwin School and Playground, the School Recreation Center, and because of the expense and difficulty of acquiring property in Brookline, the town meeting should not pass Article 5. It's true that the condos in question are next to the Baldwin School, and that the town infrequently has the opportunity to purchase this type of property, but the school department position ignores the financial realities of retaining ownership. Rent dollars are unlikely to cover the carrying costs of this property and the maintenance of the property, and those costs prevent other capital projects from being advanced. And it's imprudent for the town to hold property without a clear strategic purpose in mind. In their message to town meeting, the school committee also suggested that the Oak Street properties could be used as a component of a solution to the school overcrowding problem. That is true, but there is no currently in place agreed-to plan that contemplates the use of these properties to solve the overcrowding. The school committee is making a theoretical argument, not one based on the current plan before the electorate, and that's to renovate the Driscoll and Pierce schools and to find a location for a 9th elementary school, or to reactivate the old Lincoln school as an elementary school. With all of that said, the select board is open to keeping these properties in keeping with the Brown and Doggett resolution that the advisory committee took up this evening, should the school committee fund the entire carrying cost, including the upkeep and maintenance of these properties, out of their annual appropriation. Under that resolution, in exchange for assuming the cost of holding the properties, the school department would be the recipient of any proceeds realized should the properties be sold at a future date. This body's passage of Article 5 would not preclude a conversation occurring between the Select Board and the school committee about such an arrangement. In closing, the board, by a vote of 401, supports a vote of favorable action on the motion offered by the advisory committee.
Thank you. On the motion to, yes, Mr. Richmond?
Clint Richmond, Precinct 6. I'd signed up to speak on this article.
Speak.
Luckily, I didn't have any slides. Good evening. My name is Clint Richmond, Precinct 6. I'm speaking against warrant Article 5. Embedded in our open space plan is the requirement that there should be no net loss of open space. I think this concept should be extended to all town space, both open and built, and possibly easements for that matter. We've sold off so much highly usable space such as the former town garage in the Point and the old town reservoir in Fisher Hill. It is so difficult, as we know, to acquire space in the highly desirable town of Brookline. This is the first purchase that I can recall, correct me if I'm wrong, since the Fisher Hill Reservoir in 2011, and this process took 8 years. So we've heard about the lack of nimbleness in town meeting. It's certainly not nimble when it comes to acquiring property either. We should not be authorizing any potential sales without a concrete plan for acquiring offsetting space under this proposal to maintain a constant amount of town space. The proposal for immediate sale offered as an amendment is completely irresponsible in my opinion. And as we learned during the Webster Street Hotel project in Coolidge Corner on the former town parking lot, a 99-year lease has a higher financial return than a straight sale while preserving long-term options that simply cannot be foreseen today. It seems especially ludicrous for a property we've only held for less than a year to quickly dispose of it. Without a plan, it's impossible to have a full debate as indicated in the article explanation. The Oak Street properties are extremely rare and valuable to the town because they are adjacent to a school and a park. With no plan for realizing the land bank, which could acquire such land, holding on to this unrestricted property, and I want to underline the word unrestricted because as we've seen when trying to build new schools, there's numerous encumbrances. So we have very little flexibility even with the land that we own. Makes even more sense to hold on to this property. These buildings could be renovated in the near term for school department use, for example, and we haven't voted on warrant Article 4, unfortunately, and this is especially timely given the debate over the rising cost of the Driscoll project and the cost of putting office space in our overcrowded school buildings. I invite you to join me in voting no on this amendment and no action on the article. Thank you very much.
Mr. Spiegel?
Stanley Spiegel, Town Meeting Member, Precinct 2. I would feel much more comfortable voting for this if we had a plan in place to deal with our overcrowding issue. We don't know what will happen with the override that's coming in December. We don't know what may or may not be on the table for on Fisher Hill. I'm sorry, the college that we, a part of which we hope to acquire. I know what will happen if this gets sold. It will basically rule out using Baldwin School. I'm no big fan of Baldwin School, but if we need a 9th school, we may have to turn to that. I would like us to hold off and keep this on our books for the next few years until a decision is made how to deal with overcrowding. I would not want to rule out the Baldwin School as much as I had doubts about it when it was before us a while ago. I'm going to vote no action on this. Thank you.
Mr. Van Scoyoc?
I see my colleague Janice.
Who are you?
John Van Scoyoc, Town Meeting Member, Precinct 13. And I see Janice Kahn at the microphone. If she is to be recognized, I will defer to her.
Well, we can both be recognized, I presume.
You can both speak.
You're going to say what I was going to say, so I'm going to let you. I'm going to let you. All right, I'll say one thing that she won't. She isn't prepared to say. Real quickly, I'll say it.
Go ahead, Alphonse.
On Stanley's point, the idea of using these properties for school purposes has been discussed by the school committee, has been evaluated by the building department, has been evaluated by town council's office, and there are legal impediments, zoning impediments, and conversion impediments in terms of converting residential space to office space that led those particular parties to recommend strongly, or at least to lean strongly opposed to the idea of converting the townhouses as is into school use space. So I just want to bring that to the attention of the town meeting.
Ms. Khan?
Janice Khan, Precinct 15. John did touch on it. I was going to ask our building commissioner to please talk about how the cost of converting that property. The previous speaker mentioned that there were no impediments, really, that this could be used for anything, and I would like him to clarify that.
Is the building commissioner here?
Excuse me, Building Commissioner Dan Bennett. There are two issues with the Oak Street properties that would come across my desk. The first is converting a residential structure to a business or office use entails quite a bit of alteration. We would need an existing buildings code review for a change of use, and that would impact much of the structure with respect to architectural accessibility, rated corridors, hallways, and stairwells, the MEPs, mechanical, electrical, and plumbing systems, sprinkler systems, fire alarms, and so on. Internally, we had indicated that this cost would be somewhere in the area of $15,000 to have an architect or a design professional look into that. Charlie Simmons had estimated in his view that the conversion would be somewhere in the $800,000 to $1 million range. That's the building code side. On the zoning side, this is a residence zoning district. I do not recall if it's a T or an S zone, but there will be the necessity, if it's used for offices, in my view, school offices do not get the Dover exemption like the educational use would, and that has some zoning components that would have to be overcome with some sort of a use variance. With the past history there in the neighborhood, any one of the decisions with respect to the building code and or zoning, more likely than not would be appealed and could be held up for some time.
Thank you. I think we're ready for a vote. Oh, yes, sir.
Cliff Brown, Precinct 14. I would actually like this particular issue to be discussed by someone from the school committee, because I believe the school committee has made public statements that the office use of these properties is no longer being considered by them, and I think this body should hear that from them directly.
Are you, is that a question, Mr. Brown?
It is a question that can be addressed by the chair of the school's capital committee, or the chair of the school's finance committee, or the chair of the school committee.
How about the latter?
Hi, Julie Schreiner Oldham. I'm the chair of the school committee. So as of right now at this time, we are not considering, we have considered, but we are not actively pursuing the use of the Oak Street condos for office space. We have other options that we are discussing. One that will be discussed tonight about the use of building and space at the Driscoll project. However, as other options either happen or do not happen, that is something that the school committee would be potentially interested in discussing further. And so as of right now, we do not have active plans to utilize that because of the dollars that were associated with studying it. But it is something, depending on what other things happen down the road, that we would like to have the option to consider again.
Mr. Green?
Let me just add on to what Ms. Schreiner Oldham said. I mean, what we're hearing is that the only option is using it as office space. I mean, there are a number of other options. Using it for residential purposes, and people say it won't cover the debt service or the interest debt service. $44,000 a month, for example, rent is something that I think anyone would pay for those properties. And that itself would cover the interest rate on the band for at least the short term. Long term, this is property that with the Baldwin School could not only be used as a potential school site, but could be swapped for other land that could be used for a school site, and as a total package could be more useful to a developer than just the apartments themselves or just Baldwin School themselves. So I think there's more than just office use that we're talking about here, or we should be talking about. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. Carolyn Thal, Precinct 16. Question, I guess, for someone on school committee or school department. What is the school department currently spending annually to rent BEEP space?
Yes.
Mr. Moderator, Mary Ellen Norman, Deputy Superintendent for Administration and Finance. The CIP currently has roughly $1.4 million that we are spending for leasing classroom space for the district. That includes both BEEP classrooms, about 11, as well as 16 classrooms at 2 Clark Road.
Ms. Scotto.
Barbara, excuse me, Barbara Scotto, Town Meeting Member, Precinct 8, and member of the school committee. I think that it is obvious that the Baldwin School will be used again as a school in some form or other. It could be a BEEP program, it could be a RISE program, it could be a group from the high school. There are all kinds of things it could be used for. These buildings that are owned now could be taken down, could increase the open space around the buildings, could be used. It is pretty much adjacent to Sewell Recreation. It is beyond me that we should sell these because we have parkland right there. This would mean more parkland. It would mean more space for a play area for a school. I would think twice about selling this because the town has talked about acquiring open space when it comes up. This isn't open space now, but it could be. So I would ask you to vote in favor of keeping it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wyszynski.
Neil Wyszynski, Precinct 5. I think the only use I've heard so far is to tear these townhouses down, and if we were to do that to obtain open space, we've paid $4.5 to $5 million for 8,000 square feet of open space, and these are really lovely homes. I would suggest that we sell them and use that money for other projects. I don't see a town use for those townhouses other than building, expanding the Baldwin School, and I think that project is dead.
Thank you. Mr. White.
George Abbott White, Precinct 9. With all due respect to Mr. Wyszynski, I can think of a use. Not so many years ago, when the Newton schools were thinking in innovative ways like the Brookline schools, there was a school called Murray Road. And it was in a structure that was much smaller than this parcel. For a number of years, a very innovative program went on there with juniors and seniors from the Newton schools, Newton North and Newton South. So if you're looking for things that can be done educationally, if I had a little more time, I think I could come up with a half dozen of them. But I am reminded of what my father said years and years ago to my brother and I. Don't give up public property. You'll never get it back. Don't give up public property. You'll never get it back. And we have seen in this town in the last decade, much less the last 50 years that my wife and I have been here, the cost of property, of land, going through the ceiling. So let's think about that before we vote, and let's vote to keep it.
Mr. Sandman.
My father
did not discuss that with me. I want to remind you all.
Who are you?
Mike Sandman, Chair of the Advisory Committee and Town Meeting Member of Precinct 3. I want to remind you all that what we're voting on is Article 5, which very simply authorizes but does not compel the Select Board to sell the property. All we're doing is providing authorization with this article. Thank you.
Okay, I think we're ready for a vote on the, well, is that a call for a recorded vote? Okay, if there are 35 town meeting members that want a recorded vote, we'll have one. And there are, as always. This is on the motion on page 5-5, Article 5, main motion. The motion is to authorize the selectmen to sell the Oak Street property. It requires a 2/3 vote. Press 1 if you favor it. Make sure your handheld device is on. 2 if you're opposed, and 3 if you abstain. Well, it's a little drama here. Motion fails to obtain a 2/3 vote. 146 in favor, 77 opposed, and 3 abstentions. Despite what you read in the lower right-hand corner, the motion fails. Okay, my IT staff has advised me that they're prepared to go forward with Article 4 and the PowerPoint presentation, so we'll move now to Article 4. I won't repeat the motions before you, but Mr. Ananian, you have the floor.
Moderator, may I ask a point of order?
You can try, yeah, sure.
I can try, I can always try. Marty Rosenthal again. The question is, you alluded earlier to the fossil-free being an amendment, but I was told by Mr. Sandman there'll be no motion to delete that language. And I was confused as to which motion you were talking about. And I guess it was the original advisory committee motion, but I don't think that part of that motion is being moved.
The advisory committee and selectmen have, as far as I know, are proposing a motion in which the words fossil fuel free do not appear. Is that correct?
No, it is not correct, and I apologize to you that we did not communicate clearly that we took action subsequent to not pursue that, and we, sorry.
It's all right, I'm listening.
May I? Yeah. I'm just explaining and apologizing to the moderator that we failed to communicate to him that subsequent actions taken by the advisory committee put us in sync with the other proponents on this, the select board and the main article proponent in advocating for fossil fuel use.
And the select board is in favor of including fossil fuel free in this motion? Okay.
Thank you, and
Then
I'm
there will
very
be-
happy to hear it.
There will be no motion to amend to delete those words. Okay. It's quite helpful to get this information to the moderator before he stands up here and misinforms all of town meeting. Mr. Ananian?
Thank you again, Mr. Moderator. I slides are still there. So, so briefly, you can see now some of the other people who are co-petitioners in the article. I'll briefly thank them again, as well as thanking their families, and that's my daughter up there too. Let's make sure that this works. Yes, great, fantastic. Okay, so this motion before you is about funding a fossil fuel-free, apparently uncontested now, 4-section Driscoll School project. We're urging town meeting to approve the $115.3 million appropriation to reconstruct the Driscoll School, opening for student use in January 2023. So let me briefly go over the need for the school again, even though these are largely slides that you have seen before in December 2018 when the schematic design was approved, and again this past May when the resolution was passed. So these pictures should be familiar to you. The top classroom was a substandard special needs classroom, which the state apparently forced us to remedy this year. But that required us to move the BEEP classroom, the pre-K classroom, from Driscoll. So we no longer have a pre-K classroom at Driscoll. In the top right, we have literacy intervention occurring in the hallway. Bottom left, we have the nurses' equipment also forced out into hallway due to inadequate medical space. And in the bottom right, my phone chose the worst possible time to go to sleep, of course. I can just look and say that the teachers came up with an innovative place to put the copy equipment at the top of a stairwell because there was no other space. So Driscoll has a large number of deficient spaces. It has the largest middle school class sizes in Brookline Public Schools. In some of the smallest size middle school classrooms, many classrooms and other spaces are below the current state standards, MSBA standards we use for the rest of our schools. Common spaces like the cafeteria, the gym, the auditorium are too small to handle the present size of the school. And in addition, there's issues with outdoor areas as well. For example, the extended day program at Driscoll can't use the playgrounds because they don't meet the state standards for use by extended day. The building heating and cooling system is on its last legs and will require a multi-million-dollar replacement if the building is not replaced. And we're hoping that it lasts long enough for the new building to be built as it is. So without dwelling too much on the past, let me move to the new Driscoll. So first, again, thanking the many members of the Driscoll School Building Committee who, as I mentioned before, have been working on this since June of 2018, including Neil Wyshynski, former Select Board Chair, and Heather Hamilton, who is the co-chair for the Select Board currently, as well as Susan Wolf-Didcock from the School Committee, and a large number of other folks who are responsible for this design before you. And here it is, a beautiful building. You can see the solar panels on the roof. And importantly, the outline here, I don't want to blind the moderator, is the existing building, which is in the play field. So this is actually an important point, which is that the town doesn't have space to put the entire population of Driscoll while the building is renovated. This design allows the new building to be built in what are the playing fields for the current building. And so the kids will go to school in the existing Driscoll building up until December of 2022, and then January 2023, they walk across the field into a brand new building. And then we can start making the playing fields for them. And that's an important issue that makes this construction project feasible. And also somewhat unique among projects, we just heard several loving odes to green space in our town, and this project actually increases the available green space both for the school kids and for the surrounding community. So the existing building, as the fields are currently configured, is about 72,000 square feet. The new building allows us to get 97,000 square feet, so about a third more, 34% increase in the amount of usable green space for the kids. And of course, we all miss the old buildings which have served the school for so long, but it is true that we build buildings much better than we used to. And so the new building brings a lot of sustainability and operating cost improvements. The building is built to much better standards, much higher standards, which includes sustainability standards. But all that is sort of beside the point. The real point of building this building is for the educational needs of the kids. So the new building allows us to bring back that pre-K classroom. It provides MSBA standard space for the middle school, finally. It provides proper spaces for special education and for literacy intervention, adequate playgrounds for extended day programs, much safer walking, biking, and transport to and from the school, and I'd have to thank the Transportation Board for their work on that, and safe and accessible community spaces. So I came before you in May, pledging this as a project to reunify the town after an election which befuddled a lot of us and left us without any clear idea of how to go forward to address the challenges to the schools in the town. The Driscoll 4 project was approved in December by 220 to 2 by town meeting. We gathered 547 signatures on an open letter to kick this off, and I was before you in May. Item 67, the resolution in favor of Driscoll, passed 155 to 58. After that resolution, all sorts of folks in town worked very hard to figure out how this works. It fits into a comprehensive plan, and I'm pleased to say that the Capital Subcommittee of the School Committee endorsed a 3-school plan, including Driscoll 4, on September 10th, and the full school committee unanimously voted in favor of the Driscoll plan and warrant article 4 on the same day, actually, on September 26th. This is their motion. This is the comprehensive plan on record by the school committee to address the needs of our town, which includes Driscoll and Pierce. And then moving on from there, the select board voted in favor 4 with 1 abstention on November 5th. They set a townwide election for December 10th, and I'm pleased to say that on the Yes campaign for this upcoming election, we have school and precinct captains representing both the yes and no sides from that May election. This was important to me personally, that this be something that finally we could work together on to bring the town forward again. The Yes campaign is called Build Brookline's Future, and it doesn't have Driscoll in the name because the deliberate goal is to build an organization which can work on the Driscoll campaign and the Pierce campaign and whatever's next until the needs in town are met. Okay, so that all brings us to town meeting's job, your job, which is the appropriation. So, unfortunately, construction cost inflation is a very real factor. When this project was originally bid, well, since the time the project was originally bid, the cost of these are Massachusetts School Building Authority projects. So this is not our data. This is data from the state across all statewide, and you can see the sharp increase in the past year on building projects across the town. And then if you narrow it down to projects which are more directly comparable to the Driscoll School, you'll see a roughly 10% increase, which is consistent with what we're seeing all across the Boston area. There are steel tariffs, there are aluminum tariffs, and it's hard to get contractors to bid. Fewer bids on projects means costs go up. So this culminated in the school superintendent presenting a budget for the design as approved in May. No changes to this design from May and December, but in the current cost climate, it would cost roughly $119.7 million. That's the 10% escalation, and that's unfortunate, but that's reality. So the motion that I've put before you is a motion to preserve fossil fuel-free Driscoll. So given the reality of $119.7 million as presented by the school superintendent, there are 2 juicy-looking budget items there, and the fact that the select board and the advisory committee have only made motions for $108.8 million. The way you get from 119.7 back down to 108 is, for example, by removing the structured parking and the fossil fuel-free. I don't believe that that's what town meeting wants, and I don't believe that that our vote in December was about fossil fuel-free at the expense of the school. And so I've added to that $109 million back the cost for the fossil free school that we approved back in December to arrive at a budget of $115.3 million with an explicit fossil fuel free clause, which you can see now all the other, the select board and the advisory committee have endorsed as well. If you want to view this another way, from $108.8 million to $115.3 million is a 6% cost increase. So that's significantly below the current cost of construction inflation. So that does, I was attempting to be responsive to the concerns raised by the advisory committee and select board, and provide incentive to bring this project in under budget. But I believe that, as this slide shows, we can get a project built for 115.3, which does not sacrifice the educational goals of the town or change the design for what town meeting approved in December and May. This is the full motion, which I think you've got before you. So, in conclusion, I'm asking you to please vote yes for the petitioner's warrant article 4 motion, $115.3 million for a fossil fuel-free Driscoll, and of course, yes in the town-wide vote that will follow. And the motion action on this is a little complicated. We've already done, apparently, votes 1 and 2 on this side. We've had the motion to divide, and the amendment 2 was not moved. So I'm asking you to vote no twice more, once on the advisory committee motion, which reduces the budget to $108.3 million, while adding a request to consider administrative space, which would cost from $2.4 to $4.6 million. It seems strange to add costs while reducing the budget. The Friedman motion number 4 slashes the budget by roughly a sixth. So I would ask you to vote no on those two and yes on the main motion regardless. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ms. Hamilton and Mr. Friedman, would you come forward, please?
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Heather Hamilton speaking on behalf of the Select Board. In the fall of 2017, town meeting voted and passed a warrant article that proposed to make the ninth school fossil fuel-free, or as close to LEED Silver as possible. It passed overwhelmingly at town meeting. In the fall of 2018, the schematic design money for both Driscoll and Baldwin were tied to language requiring fossil fuel-free design as a stipulation to the funding. At this same town meeting, an easement to the fire station training facility was shot down handedly because of the sentiment that we as a community do not want to perpetuate a legacy reliant on fossil fuels. Now, in the fall of 2019, we have a warrant article that will be before us to propose no new construction for either residential or commercial properties that are reliant on fossil fuels. 3 of the sitting select board members are co-petitioners on this warrant article, and there is a broad commitment to building fossil fuel-free buildings with appropriate backup energy protection. It is in this context that I situate the Driscoll School building project, because there have been numerous proposals over the past week looking at a variety of options to change what was originally proposed back in the spring of this year. The Select Board is holding firm to the publicly advertised figure of $108.8 million for the Driscoll project that was the result of the work done by the school building committee and promised to the voters back in May. This figure will be tight given the inflation over the past 6 months, and other lower figures are unrealistic in the opinion of this board. At $108.8 million, changes may need to be made, and the Select Board looks to the leadership of the school committee in conjunction with the school building committee to come up with a list of recommendations that get us to that figure that do not compromise the promise of fossil fuel-free design. We have also asked the school committee to work with the architect to develop cost estimates and design for incorporating district-wide office space for school administration. We will continue to evaluate what makes sense given the needs and the costs. As the co-chair of the school building committee and a member of the select board, I will commit to holding to the appropriation adopted by town meeting, whatever that figure is. It is my opinion that $108.8 million is the very least amount required for this project. This project is part of a town-wide solution to the overcrowding in our schools. In every town-wide solution that the school committee reviewed this past summer, a 4-section Driscoll was part of that plan to address overcrowding. I have to admit that before serving as co-chair of the school building committee, I was suspect of spending this amount of money on Driscoll. However, this project advances not only the overcrowding, but also addresses long-standing inequities like open space, square footage per child. The select board, in a vote of 4 in favor, 0 opposed, and 1 abstention, moves favorable action on the warrant article. And in our meeting tonight, the select board took a vote to affirm our commitment that the Driscoll School project be a fossil fuel-free building in a unanimous vote. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Friedman. You have 5 minutes if you need it.
Harry Friedman, Town Meeting Member, Precinct 12, member of the advisory committee, but speaking for myself tonight. My amendment proposes a 10% reduction in the price of the Driscoll plan that was offered in the May override. It would authorize a maximum cost of $98 million. Why propose this reduction? Well, other cities and towns in Massachusetts appear to be able to build cheaper on a per square foot basis or on a cost per student basis. It's difficult to compare costs because we seem to be one of the very few systems that's a K to 8, and factor in unknown inflation amounts, and it's difficult to do an apples to apples. But other towns do it cheaper, and I'm not even talking about charter schools, which do it even cheaper than that. Further, if one looks at recent Brookline projects, we overbuild. The Coolidge Connor School, while beautiful, has a variety of finishes, laundry facilities, maker, meeting, and private music study rooms on which money could have been saved. At the high school, we're spending $6 to $8 million to get air rights from the MTA to build over the train tracks. Again, a better looking building, but one constructed seemingly without a great regard for excess costs. Why bring up past history? Because those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it, and we're repeating it at Driscoll. Our architect proposed several plans. We chose the cheapest. But originally at $109 million, it still contains unnecessary costs. It has an atrium, an expensive item with no educational value. It has a parking garage, an expensive item with no educational value. Like Coolidge Connor, it too has a variety of rooms that one might consider eliminating. We can improve on this. My amendment is putting a stake in the ground that says costs are critical and we can and must do better. The main motion at $115 million simply takes the original overpriced plan and inflates it. It shows no recognition that we need to do a better job at managing costs. Why am I harping on costs? Because for too long we have viewed school construction as being composed of individual silos with no relation to anything else. Spend $205 million on the high school. No problem if it's a standalone. Spend $115 million on Driscoll. No problem if it's a standalone. But they are not standalone projects. They are part of a queue of other projects. After Driscoll, there's Pierce. Even if we get state aid, this could be hundreds of millions of dollars. And then there's Baker, because it needs work, and because of projected growth at Hancock Village. And there could be a 9th school at Newbury. Every dollar spent on a prior project lessens the town's borrowing capacity for later projects, as well as adds to the tax burden. At some point, everything hits the fan. The voters say enough, and they vote future projects down. There were a variety of reasons why the May override failed. However, one was voter fatigue with overrides. We're doing them on an annual basis, and people's capacity and willingness to pay more in taxes is limited. They have said no once, overspend on Driscoll, and they're more likely to say no again. On Pierce, if not there, on Baker, or on some kind of school and or town operating override. If you redo your kitchen, you don't go to an architect, ask for everything kitchen-wise, and then accept the architect's quote. You determine a budget, you ask the architect for various options, and you do the one you can best afford. You push back. And if you know that within a few years of doing the kitchen, you'll need to do a roof and a bathroom, you factor that in. You build to a budget, something Brookline has not done in the past. My 10% cut amendment is an attempt to push back. The original plans were too costly, and either accepting them or inflating them is crazy. We need to be cognizant of what taxpayers are capable and willing to do and build within reasonable limits. Please vote for the low-cost amendment.
Thank you. Mr. Van Scoyac.
Good evening. I'm John Van Scoyac, Town Meeting Member and Advisory Committee Member from Precinct 13. The Driscoll School proposal that is before you tonight has gone through a rigorous process of planning and evaluation by some half a dozen committees, boards, and departments, and the process isn't over. Excuse me. You, the members of town meeting, will play an important part by your votes on warrant Article 4 and the 2 amendments that propose different price ceilings for the Driscoll project. The advisory committee urges you to vote in favor of the amendment we have jointly proposed along with the select board. If you are familiar with the story of Goldilocks, and who isn't, you recall that one bowl was too hot, one bowl was too cold, and one bowl was just right. The select board advisory committee amendment setting the Driscoll School appropriation at $108.8 million is just right. By contrast, the unamended warrant Article 4 with its price tag of $115.3 million is too hot, while the Friedman amendment with its price ceiling of $98 million is too cold. Sorry, Harry. Here's the advisory committee's reasoning as to why the price tag of $115.3 million under warrant Article 4 is too hot. You will recall that less than 1 year ago, in December of 2018, this very town meeting voted in favor of Driscoll schematic design funding. The vote was 216 to 4. In other words, just short of unanimous. The price tag given for the Driscoll project then, and until recently, was $108.8 million. The choice of the $108.8 million design was deliberate. Several other designs were offered that were more expensive, but they were rejected by the Driscoll School Building Committee. I trust that if the building committee thought that the town could afford a $115.3 million design, they would have chosen one of the pricier options at that time, but they acted prudently. Then and now, the Driscoll project has always been recognized as just one step toward meeting the renovation and rebuilding needs of several aging school buildings, as well as the possible future need for a 9th K-8 school. The Driscoll cost must be kept within the bounds of affordability, not just for one project, but for a combined 3 or 4 projects for which the Driscoll project will set the standard. In that sense, a $115.3 million project could turn out to be just too hot to handle. But what about construction cost inflation, you say? Well, what about it? We hear all kinds of numbers quoted in authoritative tones. But do we really know how construction cost inflation will impact Driscoll once ground is broken? The design isn't even final yet. A nip here, a tuck there in the final design could compensate, or more than compensate, for the X factor, the unknown outcome of all the contractor and subcontractor bidding and the fluctuating materials costs. As for those who raise the fear that we can't meet the goal of making Driscoll fossil fuel free unless we go higher than the $108.8 million price tag, I defer to our fellow town meeting member and my neighbor, Werner Lowy, sort of a neighbor, Precinct 13. Werner is a longtime member of the Climate Action Committee, and he has worked hard on several of the green energy initiatives we face at this town meeting. He wrote, "We firmly believe that this fossil fuel-free school will cost little or no more than a standard building that uses gas." And he adds, "We believe that a detailed analysis would show that little or no extra funds will be needed." All right then. What about the Friedman Amendment, calling for a price tag of $98 million? Well, yes, it is possible that an 800-student, 4-section school could be built for $98 million, but not this kind of 4-section school with this kind of quality. In the view of the advisory committee, $108.8 million is the necessary budget for the educational program, the quality, and the support spaces that a school for the future requires. At $98 million, Driscoll parents would get a school building that is less than they expect, and children would get less than they deserve. The amendment brought to you by the advisory committee and the select board strikes a balance. On the one hand, it seeks prudence, given the reality that Driscoll is the beginning, but far from the end of meeting the challenge of school rebuilding and expansion. On the other hand, it seeks excellence in the educational and design standards of this and future projects, and it honors fossil fuel free. Our amendment would also go one important step further. The office staff of the Brookline Public Schools face the reality of a space crunch. Because of lease expirations and changes in space planning to accommodate more classrooms, the Brookline Public Schools will need space for the relocation of some 60 office staff by September of 2020, in time for the start of the next school year. For that reason, the amendment in favor of a $108.8 million Driscoll appropriation includes this language, quote, "With the understanding that the final stages of project design will include efforts to further optimize the project's design in terms of both program delivery and cost efficiency, including the evaluation of the feasibility of providing office space for district-wide staff of the Brookline Public Schools," end quote. For these reasons, we, the Advisory Committee, urge you to support the Select Board Advisory Committee amendment to Warrant Article 4 and then vote in favor of Warrant Article 4 as amended. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Richmond. And while you're coming to the mic, I want to change the tally on Article 5. It was 147, not 146 to 77. Still failed. Mr. Richmond? 3 minutes.
Good evening, Clint Richmond, Precinct 6 again. I strongly support public schools. However, I feel that Driscoll 4 represents the latest failure by town government to address student growth. We've been unable to agree on a site for a 9th school. Instead, we've made every school significantly bigger. And I hope my slide, where's my slide, please? And most acutely in North Brookline, resulting in a more urban feel for these schools. Our population is not going down, so what's the solution? I've spoken consistently in favor of smaller schools. I've never heard anyone say they wish they went to a school that was bigger unless it was a rural one. Our elementary schools have gotten so large, they are no longer recognizable to those of us who had children attending 15 years ago. The worst part is that the grounds have not gotten bigger, leading to undersized space for lunch, assembly, offices, storage, and extended day. We have overused playgrounds, which has even led to artificial turf at Coolidge Corner and for the Pierce Playground. I feel that large schools should be avoided for educational and social reasons, such as maintaining personal connections and building community, a school where everyone knows each other. Traveling in large schools is longer, it takes longer, and is more difficult for lunch and specials, especially for early elementary students. For example, I heard a Coolidge Corner parent testify at a school select board hearing about his special needs student feeling overwhelmed at Coolidge Corner. Traffic from student drop-offs, staff parking, deliveries, and trash keeps getting worse. 4 sections, roughly 800 students, is too large. 4 and 5 section schools tend towards middle schools within a larger school, which undermines our unified K-8 model. I supported 4-section Driscoll reluctantly as a compromise in a comprehensive spring plan, but remember well when the Driscoll community was adamantly opposed to 4 sections just a few years ago, led by their beloved principal, Carol Schraft. As a Pierce parent, I would oppose 5-section Pierce. Old Lincoln is a substandard location and should not be a permanent school. These are not solutions. Our schools have gotten so big they have outgrown the single swing space for renovations. I cannot support a 4-section Driscoll without a concrete plan that includes a 9th school and other permanent buildings. We should be talking about universal pre-K and earlier grades in our schools, not 4-section K-8. We might not be proposing a first-class, potentially expandable 3-section fossil fuel-free Driscoll if we had a wider plan. There is no reason to vote on Driscoll 4 now. A 4-section Driscoll may be premature and fiscally unwise given the net cost per new classroom. It could limit our ability to fund more economical alternatives, which might include Newberry or Maimonides. We need to find the will to figure this out. If we keep enlarging existing schools, we defer that hard decision, and we are doing a disservice to our children. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Perlman. And Mr. Gasiach, would you come forward, please, and sit in the front row?
David Perlman, Town Meeting Member, Precinct 15, and School Committee Member, speaking on behalf of a unanimous school committee. By a vote of 9 to 0 to 0, the school committee recommends favorable action on Warrant Article 4. Due to the many late-breaking developments on Driscoll project cost estimates, our vote of September 29th reflects the May 2019 pre-inflation construction cost estimate of $108.8 million. To be abundantly clear, this should not be construed as opposition by school committee to higher bonding numbers in excess of $108.8 million. On November 12, 2019, at a joint meeting of the Select Board and School Committee, our interim superintendent, Ben Lummis, addressed project delay escalation costs and explained that if we do not fully fund the Driscoll project at a level commensurate to these escalation cost increases, we will have no choice but to compromise our educational and wellness objectives for the building. Examples of scope reductions found in cheaper schools include minimized special education space, minimized ESL space, smaller, more crowded classrooms, no pre-kindergarten classrooms, fewer community-wide benefits, limited gym facilities, no multi-purpose room or auditorium, no full-service kitchen, and no dedicated music or art spaces. A few of you might be concerned about the implications of this Driscoll project on other town-wide school space needs. Rest assured, the school committee strives for equity across all of our K-8 schools. As such, we recognize that the Driscoll School project represents only one part of our town-wide capital facilities plan. By a vote of 9-0, school committee endorsed a 3-part plan of a Pierce School upgrade, a 4-section Driscoll School, and a 2-section school with additional educational programs to be determined. Our committee recognizes that no matter what combination of paths we pursue to fulfill our town-wide capital needs, a 4-section Driscoll appears in all of them. Driscoll is already past its expected useful life, with substandard spaces ill-equipped to serve our current student population of diverse needs. The 4-section Driscoll, as planned, reduces town-wide overcrowding in one of our most walkable, densely populated areas, adding about 200 students over the current school when including pre-kindergarten. It adds developmentally appropriate learning spaces, much-needed dedicated spaces for town-wide special education programs that benefit all of our schools, maker spaces to support design and engineering, art and music rooms to spur creative expression, 21st century science labs that foster innovation and discovery, collaborative spaces for our teachers, and a 34% increase in green space. While the Driscoll School Building Committee closely considered whether to renovate or build new, it favored a rebuild for several reasons. First, a full, not just partial, right-sized, emissions-free retrofit, renovation, and expansion were estimated to be more expensive than building new. Second, building new on the current playground saves significant money on temporary swing space, as it allows the students to remain in the current school while the new one is built. Third, the new building as currently designed would be fossil fuel free, in keeping with the spirit of prior pro-sustainability school committee recommendations to town meeting. Fossil fuel free constructions provide opportunities for long-term savings in operational maintenance costs. Fourth, as previously mentioned, building new allows for a 34% increase in play space, a benefit to both Driscoll students and to the community at large. Proceeding with this Driscoll 4 rebuild does not solve all of our school facility needs, but it represents a critical, time-sensitive, substantial step in the right direction. Let's unite for our schools and vote yes on warrant Article 4.
Thank you, Mr. Gasiach. And Mr. Liu, would you come forward, please?
Yeah, that's fine.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Dave Gayshok, Town Meeting Member, Precinct 13, and a parent of 2 kids at the Heath School, which will not be directly impacted by the Driscoll project, but is strongly in support. As you heard last week, Superintendent Lummis and the project team reported that the cost of the project that we all have supported strongly since last December is no longer $108.8 million. With construction cost escalation that we cannot control, that cost for that same project is now $119.7 million. At that cost, when you adjust for historical inflation to make it apples to apples, that's still less expensive per student and per square foot than the Coolidge Corner School was. It's still less expensive per student and per square foot than Baldwin would have been. It's well within the range, as you can see from some examples on this slide, of normal for recent comparable school building projects around the greater Boston area. We're not building luxury here, we're building high quality. The main motion on Article 4, as Mr. Nanian said, already cuts that price tag back to $115.3 million. It already reflects compromise between high quality program and cost savings. Cutting it back further to 108.8 or 98 million is not cutting fat. That's already been done. That's cutting muscle or cutting bone in this case. If you are thinking of voting for one of those lower numbers, before you do so, please ask yourself, do you really know what has to be cut to make that number work? Is that really worth cutting? So let me give you the flip side of those cuts. The main motion at $115.3 million would raise our property tax bills by approximately 3.4%. That's about $135 a year for a $700,000 home, which is the median Brookline condominium unit, and it's about $420 a year for the median single family, which is valued at $1.6 million. The motion to amend to 108.8 that the Select Board and Advisory Committee have put forward would save less than $1 a month on that median condo unit tax bill and less than $2 a month on that median single family tax bill. Even my friend Mr. Friedman's amendment would cut that building to the bone. It wouldn't be a stake in the ground, as he said, it would be a stake in the heart. It would still save less than $2 a month in taxes on that median condo unit, and it would save about $5 a month in taxes on that median single family. Unless we know carefully and closely what we can actually cut and not sacrifice the quality of the building, is that really worth it? Please ask yourself before you vote on the amendments. Please join me in voting no on the various amendments and voting yes on the main Article 4 motion as outlined in the voting guide, regardless of how the amendments turn out. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Liu. And Ms. McClellan, would you please come forward, sit in the front row? Now, when I invite speakers to come forward and sit in the front row when they're through giving their presentations, I'd appreciate their going back to their seats and further back in the auditorium to free up space in the front row for additional speakers. Mr. Liu.
Andy Liu, town meeting member from Precinct 10 and the father of a second grader at Pierce School. And I'm speaking simply in support of a yes vote on the main motion, no matter what happens when we vote first on the amendments. And this is because I think tonight's vote is about much more than just Driscoll. So as you've heard, Driscoll is part of a three-part plan that also includes renovating Pierce. And moving ahead with Pierce is going to depend crucially on getting matching funds from the MSBA. This is the state agency that supported the Heath and Runkle School renovations, and it's contributed over $23 million so far just for the rebuilding of the Coolidge Corner School. Now, the MSBA has not committed yet to giving us matching funds for the Pierce renovation. They're going to be watching this vote closely to see whether they can actually count on Brookline to unite behind funding school construction. Now, it's quite true, as we've heard, that we can't be thinking just about Driscoll. I'm not. And we're facing a town-wide problem whose solution has to be town-wide. Well, this vote and the upcoming election are about more than just Driscoll. They're also about whether we can unite, whether we have the political will to be a reliable partner for the state of Massachusetts, whose help we need for solving our town-wide problem. So, even if tonight's amendment process results in a number that's higher or lower than what you prefer, I urge you to consider the wider picture and vote yes on the main motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. McClellan. And Mr. Gertler, would you please come forward?
Nicole McClellan, I'm a town meeting member in Precinct 11, and my daughter will be in Driscoll, hopefully just in time for construction to start for 2 years. I want to say before we start, in what has been a really sort of contentious time in town, it's been awesome to see the broad support that has coalesced around this effort. Now that we do have a ballot question, we have support from every school community and a captain in every precinct, and a lot of people working for this. So it has been, as Scott and Nanian promised, a unifying effort, and it's I'm grateful for that. And I want to Also mention that included in the support is the current principal of Driscoll School, Dr. Talukdar, who does support this project. I won't go into too much detail about the cost inflation since that's been covered by my co-petitioners that have come before me. I would just remind you to sort of reset the baseline, which is the number that was actually put forth to pay for this project without any changes from the project we all supported previously is $119 million. So the amendment, the main motion for 115.3 is actually a level down from that. And that $119 million number was arrived at using widely accepted figures for construction cost inflation and figures that were repeatedly put forth as fact by the Select Board, School Committee, and the Yes Campaign in May, and one that is regularly cited by the MSBA based on their comprehensive review of building projects in the Commonwealth. I do think it's important to be really prudent with our decisions about this, because even if not all of us in this room can agree on details, I think we can all agree that telling taxpayers that a project can be done for a certain amount when in fact it cannot, and then forcing the town to have to find a way to absorb millions of dollars in overages, which is something that we are currently dealing with at Brookline High School, is not good government or good finance. So please don't lose sight of the big picture. Putting forth and supporting an unrealistic number with no plan for how we arrive at that number may make us feel better and make us feel like we're being fiscally responsible and can allow us to tell constituents we voted for a lower number. But unless we can identify exactly where those cuts are coming from without compromising the educational programming of the school, and how to do that in a way that doesn't trigger significant redesign that would irrevocably compromise an already delayed schedule, which again will cost money, then we're not actually achieving that. So I urge you tonight to base your vote on economic and temporal realities, not on a wish, and vote on something we know that we can deliver on, which is the main motion to appropriate $115 million to rebuild and expand the Driscoll School. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gertler.
Thank you, Nicholas Gertler, Precinct 11, and a Driscoll dad. You know, I want to rebut a couple of the points made by some of the opponents of the main motion, but the thing that I'm reminded of, other than the dollars and cents, a couple of weeks ago, I went into the school after it has started to take a coat to my daughter who refuses to dress weather appropriately, much to her mother's chagrin. And so a few weeks ago, I went into the school to drop off a jacket for my daughter who consistently refuses to dress weather appropriately, much to the frustration of her mother. And as I'm walking down the hallway in the middle of the school day, I just come across a young student sitting with a teacher in the middle of the hallway, obviously struggling with their reading. And I just had this visceral reaction like I was witnessing something that really should be the private struggles of this student. It shouldn't be out there for the whole school and anyone who happens to wander by to see. So it would be wonderful to have a shiny new school with all the right rooms, but I think this is about something much more fundamental, which is just about the dignity of the students. That being said, Mr. Friedman's suggestion to eliminate certain rooms and certain features of the school, I would orient you back to Scott's presentation and all of the people involved in designing the school and setting the requirements of this school and really putting in all the elements necessary for our children to be successful in the 21st century. As to voter fatigue, it does seem that there will be a number of expenditures that will be needed. Is that 10% going to make a meaningful difference in avoiding voter fatigue? There is really no reason we have been offered to believe that it's that 10% that will meaningfully change voter attitudes about not just this override, but any potential future ones. And really that 10% cut is, with respect, entirely arbitrary. So another speaker mentioned the need for smaller school and the 9th school, and I'm relatively new to town politics here, but that sounded to me like deja vu all over again. And if we're going to go back into that infinite loop, I think the only thing we'll see is further delay and further inflation of the cost of the ultimate solution, which, as we hear, must involve Driscoll, and with really almost universal support for a 4-section Driscoll. So thank you, and please vote for the main motion.
Mr. Rosenthal?
Yes, Marty Rosenthal again. I have a two-part question. The first one is, I understood from reading the material and hearing from Scott that the extra between the two motions was largely for fossil-free construction, but now there seems to be a consensus in favor of that, but not in favor of raising the amount. So that's question number one. Why is that not an extra amount to justify the higher figure? And shall I throw in my second question, because it might be answered with it? It's a little dumber because I should know the answer, as formerly on the advisory committee and what was called the Board of Selectmen. The question is, if we appropriate 108 and costs come in higher, what's the process to pay for those extra costs?
You come back to town meeting, and if you want to bond it, you come back to, or even fill it in with an appropriation.
Well, that's what I assume, but why is that not an option that anybody's talking about?
Certainly is.
All right, so maybe get back to the first question. Did I misinterpret what Scott was saying, that the additional money was originally intended to be largely for fossil-free, but now both the august groups in front of me are saying we don't need that additional money for fossil-free? So what am I misunderstanding here?
Yeah, Mr. Go ahead.
Good evening, I'm Ben Lummis, Interim Superintendent for the Public Schools of Brookline. To the moderator, to the town meeting, if I understand your question correctly, I think this slide helps answer it. You'll
well,
see
actually, it helps show it. All right, go on.
even better. On the left-hand side are the original project total costs that the town meeting voted on and approved in the springtime. You'll see that it's broken out into different pieces. Building and site, obviously, play area, structured parking, and then the fossil fuel-free allowance. Because of the delay from the vote and because of the escalations as we've detailed, you'll see that the escalation applies to those different areas. So what we're saying is, and not that you would take off any one of these or bit by bit, but we're just trying to break out the different components of it that may be considered either extra or additional from one community to the next. So you can see on the right-hand column the revised total project cost, and those are the different components. So the balance between the 119.7 and the Mr. Nadian's motion, includes structured parking. It would not include the play area, but does include structured parking.
All right, I think I now see that I was talking about the gross figure of 6.9, but it's only a $600,000 difference on that. All right, well, thank you.
And also, just to reiterate, it doesn't mean we would take, there'll be some design work to figure out whatever number is approved by town meeting, what would be allowed, basically.
Okay, thanks.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, Kathleen O'Connell, Precinct 14. I'm also a teacher, and so one of the questions I have is, I know that the school department has some budget issues right now with more of the operating budget issues, but I question that we're spending all this money on buildings when we don't seem to have enough money for our operating budget, which would to be pay for special education services we need, to pay for teachers' raises that were in the budget last year. So I get that we want to build like Cadillac schools, but it would seem like we also want to make sure that what's going on in the schools we can pay for. So at some point, I do think it all comes out of the same bucket of money we're asking taxpayers to pay. And it just seems to me that, you know, school buildings are great, but we also need to be able to have the services within the school and the paras that we need and things like that. And I get it comes out of a different budget, but it all seems to come out of the taxpayers' pockets too.
You're right about that. Ms. Frawley?
Regina Frawley, Town Meeting Member, Precinct 16. I probably have spent as many hours on this topic over the last couple of years of any topic that we've ever voted. I heard lots of objections to the original Driscoll petition on the basis that we should be going to the School Building Authority for funding, and the opposition said, no, no, you can't do more than one at a time. Some of the people speaking tonight were those people who said we can go to the school building and get in the queue if we're making this case for the desperate need that we have, like for the Pierce, et cetera. I'm wondering why tonight I'm the first person to mention the School Building Authority that would pay up to 40% of our expenses, and then we can give you the Cadillac. Could somebody please tell me why we're not discussing that, why we're not considering that? Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Superintendent Loomis?
Ben Loomis, Superintendent of Schools. As has been said quite a few times, the Mass School Building Authority will only work with a community on one project at a time. This was once again asked and confirmed. We met with the MSBA 2 weeks ago as part of our the Pierce project, and Helen Chalupsky, school committee member, asked that direct question. And once again, they confirmed that, you know, by all accounts, they do one priority project at a time. They did explain that in very rare cases they have done more than one, but that is not in the offing at this point, and that we should not pursue that or expect that that would be possible.
Thank you, Mr. Levy.
Hi, Mark I've been waiting over here, little woman.
You're
here.
next.
Well, I was next before, but thank you.
We'll get to you. Be patient.
I am. Thank you.
My name is Mark Levy.
I've actually been standing here longer than Mr. Levy, although
Okay,
I
Mr.
do
Levy,
always,
do
I enjoy
you
hearing
mind?
from
I will
Mr.
yield
Levy,
my
so.
time to this
Go
young
right ahead.
lady.
Go right ahead. No need to.
Actually, I would love to hear from Mr. Levy because I appreciate his comments and I see that he might be uncomfortable standing. So please go ahead, it's fine, thank you.
Okay, we went around Robin
Alf-
Miss Barnes.
go
so
ahead,
let's-
Alphonse.
And got back where we started. My name is Mark Levy, Town Meeting Member, Precinct 7. I have a comment, and I won't even bother trying to disguise it as a question. The comment is that I'm afraid that going up to $115.3 million, the headline in the tab will be town meeting raises the cost of Driscoll School to taxpayers. And I know that if that we're going to get leafleted over and over again all throughout the town with leaflets saying you can't trust the selectmen of the school committee or town meeting. They'll raise the money, they'll raise your costs for whatever reason. And with only 3 weeks left till the election, I don't think we can explain the inflation in a way that's convincing to the average voter who doesn't follow these things closely. On the other hand, I think $98 million is just too low because it would require us to do a thorough redesign of the school, I fear. And delay is the one thing we cannot afford at this point. Every year we delay is another year that students at Driscoll get educated in a substandard facility. And that certainly is not why we're here tonight, and that's not why I fought for the question 1 back in May, and why I'm supporting Driscoll, whatever the final outcome is on these amendments. So my comment is we should pass the $108.8 million. If we can't get that figure down in time to continue on schedule to the cost of the building after bidding and all isn't around that figure fairly closely, we should come back to town meeting, and if it's the will of town meeting, we can increase that fund or not. That'll be a choice for another day. But I would also say that in fairness to the voters of the town, since the difference between 1.5 million, 115 million, and 108 million or 109 million is roughly $6 million, that works out to debt service that comes in around $450,000 for the early years and then declines steeply after that. And I think I would recommend to the selectmen, if they do have to come back for further appropriation, that it go within the town budget and not be covered within the debt exclusion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I know I'm hard to see because I'm a little bit small. I am struggling to
Let's have your name and precinct.
Oh, I'm sorry. Carolyn Thal, Precinct 16. I'm struggling to understand the numbers here with respect to that we're being told 10% and actually in the motion itself 15.7% inflation accounts for this ballooning cost of the project. And I know that we were shown a couple of slides that have the numbers 15.7% and 10% on them. But I looked carefully at those slides after listening to the petitioner at the League of Women Voters Forum the other night. And the data on those slides and the source data, MSBA, actually don't show 10% inflation has recently happened or that 15% inflation is predicted by MSBA. I think those slides, I guess, were created by the architect's cost estimator. But I really would love to hear from the petitioner his understanding of those slides because I don't think the data is there to support saying that we should accept a 10% cost inflation because the only thing that's really shown, especially on the first slide with the 15.7, maybe it could be brought up, is that FY 17 to 18, the other one. Okay, thank you.
Okay, Superintendent.
So my
Loomis.
question is, can somebody explain how you got 15.7% inflation predicted when MSBA does not use jobs that are in schematic design, which are those blue circles, to predict? And that in fact, when jobs are bid historically and done historically, the MSBA data shows that they cost out lower than schematic. So I'm struggling with that 15.7 and the 10 because
I think we understand your question.
Thanks.
I'm going to ask Jim Rogers from Left Field, who is our owner's project manager and who is responsible for making these calculations to explain the escalation and also current costs and bidding in the Commonwealth. I just do want to add, as someone referred to earlier, is the bidding he'll talk about is something that we're experiencing right now in the high school. It's from actual experience, partly from that we're experiencing here in Brookline, but also that we're experiencing across the city, across the Commonwealth, and also the actual escalation. So Jim, if you could help us, please.
Good evening. My name is Jim Rogers. I'm the principal of Left Field. We're the OPM firm responsible for managing this project on behalf of the town. And it's part of our calculation for the reason why the project has gone up 10% in cost as of right now. And I can explain how we got to that number and why that escalation and increase is being realized on this project. So if we look at this slide, and we look at sorry, I'm trying to look at both here. Fiscal year, from fiscal year 2018, 2019 to then fiscal year 2019 and 2020, it's the last two boxes. And this is information from the MSBA's website. And yes, the MSBA does base their cost after schematic design and moving forward. And what we found is in the 2018 and 2019, there were 10 projects within that box. The second to last box there contains 10 projects. We know what those 10 projects are. We know what the cost per square foot is. If we take the average of those costs in that second to last box, it's $434 a square foot. If we look at the last box, where there are 17 projects accumulated there by the MSBA, the average cost for the projects in that box is $516. If we do the cost increase in between the 434 and the 516, it's actually higher than the 15% shown there because we've taken out some projects that have failed to vote. It's actually an 18.77% increase. So
But
that's
those jobs have not been bid, and the source data, okay.
Let's let the gentleman answer
Okay.
your question.
Can I follow up afterwards, Mr.
You
Moderator?
certainly may.
Thank you.
The MSBA we based our cost on the schematic design estimate. The MSBA first based their cost on the schematic design estimate. So I'm comfortable with what we're showing here. Not wanting to burden the project, any further than the 5% that was carried originally for 1 year, we've added 10% in the year that's been extended because of the original failed vote here with Driscoll. So it's an effective of the first 5% for 1 year. The additional 10% for the added year of duration is 15%. If we divide that by 2, there's an effective escalation rate of 7.5% for this project, which we feel is very reasonable. Currently, left field, we have 6 core projects going on with the MSBA and 7 accelerated repair projects. We have projects down the street. We have 4 projects at BU, for example. Those projects range from $15 million to $300 million. And a project estimate that I was brought in with last week at BU, again, literally probably 5 minutes down the road, the construction manager, the major construction manager in downtown Boston suggested that we were now realizing escalation rates of 12 to 18%. That's where the market is. There's no capacity out there. We've got a very hot construction market. There's low capacity. There's therefore low competition. And with low competition comes erratic pricing. That's the market we're dealing with. We're in an urban environment, which pushes the prices even further. So again, we're seeing escalation that outpaces what we've calculated here, but we've tried to be reasonable with the town folk. Thank you.
Thank you. So 2 things. First of all, that slide shows that FY, and I'm sorry I can't see it, I think this is correct, 17 to 18 and 18 to 19, based on the averages shown there, although one of them is incorrect, 395 should be 402. So FY 17 to 18 and 18 to 19 prices of those bid and completed jobs, the filled-in squares, went up about 4% each of those fiscal years. This slide, where you go into that last big jump, is showing jobs that have not been bid. As you said, some of them won't even happen. When you go to the source data on the MSBA website, anybody can open up their laptop and look at it right now, there is a graph that shows the relationship between the orange and the blue. Schematic design estimates and actual costs that have happened. And the actual costs are lower historically. Significantly, not statistically significant, I don't know if that's true, but substantially lower. So that is not accounted for in that giant jump to 15.7%. That line should not go up at that angle, because when you look at the source data, the actual relationship is different, and that line does not account for that fact. So I have difficulty accepting that we should accept this very high-priced project because of inflation that the slides do not show.
Thank you, Ms. Thal.
Thank you.
Ms. Nobrega.
Thank you, Mariah Nobrega, Precinct 4. I have one comment and 2 comments and 1 question. My first comment is that I think it would be a great outcome if, as we just heard, the actual price come in less than the prices we see on this slide. That would be good. My second comment is that the increase proposed by Mr. Ananian is actually at 6%, which is less than the 7.5% that the OPM just discussed. And then my question is to perhaps someone in the school department, if we were to reduce the project from 115 back to the 108, what would we lose?
Superintendent Loomis.
So, thank you for the question. This raises a scenario which I will call Goldilocks plays dominoes. The challenge with this is that essentially, with the increased cost and escalation, or I should say escalation and inflationary pressures, we've shown town meeting and select board and others that the actual cost from what you voted on in the spring is now $119.7 million. Now, cutting that to 109 million, 100.8 is actually a 10% cut. The challenge with that, and what we're showing here, and we explained to the select board earlier this month, is that that'll force redesign. Okay, a 10% cut in any design project isn't simple, just finishes and some movement of spaces. It actually takes redesign. Okay, and that's going to extend the schedule. We'll have to reopen schematic design. That'll extend the schedule 3 months or so. As we show on the slide here, that'll cost additional money. And then we get into extending the timeline, okay? That does two things to the timeline. It creates more escalation costs, okay? And then it also extends the timeline so students aren't moving to school till most likely or potentially fall of the following year, okay? So you not only have, and this is the dominoes part, there's a domino effect, okay? One leads to the next, which leads to the next, which leads to the next. In addition to $108.8 million, there's also in language the request to add office space, which is increases by $2.7 million or $2.4 million to have upwards of 25 staff members in the space. That continues though. What I'm getting at is, although you may vote on 108.8, with the redesign that has to happen, with extending the timeline that has to happen, with adding the administrative spaces that has to happen, and then also the escalation that proceeds from that, you're actually lowering the actual dollars towards the 98.8 or towards $100 million in terms of actual design. So there are impacts of cutting the project scope by 10% or in some cases 20%. That will impact the costs and delay the project even further.
All right, I'll allow that motion. I have no further speakers signed up, but you see who's at the microphone, and we can continue with questions.
Mr. Moderator, I did sign up to speak. This is Nathan Spritz from 16. I sent you an email last week.
Well, I must have missed yours in one of the 400 emails that I got that day. Sorry. The question's been called. There's a second. And if you want to hear from more speakers from the floor, you'll not pass the motion which requires a 2/3 vote. If you do pass the motion, we will proceed directly to a vote. There will be no more comments from the floor, no more presentations. So, with that in mind, all those in favor of calling the question, terminating debate, please raise your hands. Those opposed? The chair is in doubt. We'll have a electronic vote, but this is not a recorded vote. It's just to test test whether a 2/3 vote has been achieved. So this is actually, it's not a recorded vote, so you don't need to record it. 1 will terminate debate, 2 will continue. Motion fails, and we'll hear from you, Mr. Spritz.
While we're amending the speakers list, I believe we also had a non-town meeting member sign up to speak, Kim Loscalzo, which requires permission of town meeting, of course.
Well, we'll hear from Mr. Spritz first.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Nathan Spritz from Precinct 16. Short or long version? Go with the short one. I wrote two. So I'll keep this short. We have an opportunity to do the right thing tonight and to get Driscoll going. Sorry. We have an opportunity tonight to do the right thing and to get Driscoll going. But we've not gotten here in quite the right way. It was only last week that we learned about the cost escalation, adding $10.9 million to the project costs. We've had no meetings and we've had no careful vetting. Both the advisory committee approach and Mr. Friedman's amendment force a careful study. Advisory does this explicitly. Friedman does it through establishing a budget that requires a redesign. I think that we should be careful about what features we put into our schools, and we should consider costs and the possible need to have to repeat these 7 times. Therefore, I'm voting for an approach that makes us think about the design and to consider construction costs seriously for longer than just 1 week. I'm going to support any of the 3 versions that survive tonight. I want to do the right thing. We have to pass Driscoll. So please also do the right thing after this is over and support the article. And if you agree with me, join me in doing it, not only doing the right thing, but doing it the right way and studying what we're doing at Driscoll. Thank you.
Thank you. You've been very patient.
Hi, Laura Baines Walsh, Precinct 16. I actually have a clarifying question for the chair of the school committee. In an open letter to the select board that Mr. Antonini, I'm sorry if I butchered your name, sent on behalf of many Driscoll parents, he noted that this project would add 185 classrooms. Can you talk to us about exactly how many K through 8 classrooms this project would add?
Yes, Ms. Schreiner-Oldham.
Seats. How many K through 8 seats?
I would add 135 seats and approximately 10 classrooms.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir.
Brian Bergstein, Precinct 6. So I feel like as a Pierce parent and someone who's been watching this process unfold for a long time, I want to echo the fact that I think it's absolutely urgent that we deal with Driscoll, but we also have to take into account just what a shame it is that our schools have fallen into the crisis conditions that they're in. And so that's why it's very important to me that we do this in a way that preserves the chance that we can get more work done on the schools in the future. So this question of cost, I think, is getting an unsatisfying explanation. So we have before us A, B, and C, and if we call A the kind of high end and C the low end, B has been described as the Goldilocks plan. At least under C, which I wouldn't support, at least Mr. Friedman is at least articulating a sort of worldview, a belief on the schools. You know, there's certain rooms he feels like we could do without, at Coolidge Corner. And you can accept or not accept that sort of educational philosophy. But it's really hard, I have to say, as someone who wants to make sure we do this in a way that doesn't undermine support for future overrides, really what the difference is between A and B. So let me come back to a question that my colleague, Ms. Nobrega, asked just a few minutes ago. She said, what would we lose in the $108 million option that we would have in the 115? And all we really are hearing is a little bit of hand waving about that. So far tonight we've heard that, well, look, it's only $1 or $2 more per month in property taxes between 108 and 115. Doesn't really answer the question. Most directly, when she just asked that question, she was told, well, look, it's going to go back and force us to do a redesign. It's also not really that satisfying, because why is the question? Why would it require a redesign? We had a bunch of plans on the table before we settled on the one that was approved and now is inflated by some percentage. And as Ms. Stahl has pointed out, that percentage maybe is debatable. But the real question is, what are we buying? What is A and what is B? And I have not heard a good explanation other than it's going to force us to do a redesign. So why does it force us to do a redesign that would take so long? Some design work is going to be necessary anyway to conform the amount that we approve to what is going to actually get bid and built. So can we get a clear explanation of what might be lost at the B/Goldilocks price, and why that will require a redesign at the Goldilocks price that is so lengthy? Thank you.
Superintendent Loomis, try again.
So it would be square footage, and where that square footage would be, whether it's in science labs or special education classrooms or the library or the multipurpose room or makerspace or the pre-K classrooms. We don't know yet. If it's a 10% cut, it will require redesign. That requires more time, which extends the timeline for building and bidding, and then the cost. But that I can't give you, and the architects can't give us more detail than that between the 119 and the 108, because it requires redesign, because it's a 10% cut in the project, and that's much more than finishes or floors, that sort of thing.
But wait, just so I understand, it's not 119 and 108. The main motion would be for 115, right?
Right, but it's the way the building is designed now is 119. So, and plus, the administrative office space, which is also in the motion. So, we're comparing it to what it actually would, the way it's designed, actually what it would cost to whatever's passed. And if you're talking about 108, then that's the redesign. That's what triggers redesign, is that 10% cut. Or maybe I'm not understanding your question.
Well, if I...
Well, let's not have a conversation here. Do you have another question, sir?
No, it's fine, Mr. Moderator. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Selwyn?
Thank you. Lee Selwyn, Town Meeting Member, Precinct 13. When we were looking at those MSBA inflation figures a little while ago, I think the high-end number was $516 a square foot. Is that correct? Yeah, so if you multiply $516 by the 155,000 square feet in the Driscoll, and I did take out my calculator, I was waiting here and did the math, it comes out to about $80 million. It's what? What's the difference?
Well, let's let Mr. Selwyn ask his question.
Well, I guess, that's part of my question is where do we get from 80 million to 108 million? If other school systems are able to build a building with all that inflation built in for $516, why can't we?
What you're seeing here on the square foot for the Driscoll project is total project costs. Okay, what you're seeing on the MSBA, I'm not sure where the slide is here, are construction costs. In terms of the difference between those two, they're significant. I might need some help here, but in terms of total project cost includes design cost, includes permitting, includes OPM, includes a significant number of additional costs beyond construction. So I understand the concern here and the question, but we're looking at two different square footage numbers. One is construction costs, that's the lower number here, and the number for the total is the total project cost per square foot.
Okay, OPM, that means other people's money, is that right?
Well played, Mr. Selwyn, well played.
I just want to offer one comment. We happen to take Article 5 out of order, and it's kind of interesting because Article 5, the school committee was essentially asking for basically almost $5 million, which is the order of magnitude that they could get for selling that property without any specific plan or use other than even the possibility that might hold on to it for 50 or 100 years. Had we sold, we voted here, we didn't get the 2/3 vote, and we lost by 3 votes. Almost 2/3 of the people in this room voted not to give the school committee the discretion to use that space. If we agreed to sell that and you take it off the 115 million, we'd be back down at the roughly the 108 that they're looking for. My comment about OPM, which I must admit I just dreamed up when you used it. I think this is a real problem. The school committee seems to want it all, and here's a perfect example of asking for $5 million with no particular plan, no particular use, and I'm having a very difficult time understanding how you use the construction inflation rate and then applied it to these various other categories of cost. It doesn't make sense. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Julie Jetty, Precinct 16. I'm also very concerned, given that this project, doesn't solve most of the overcrowding problem in Brookline schools, that our voters are going to have continued appetite for overrides and such. And the project that has been most frequently mentioned as a possible ninth school site has been Newberry College. I noticed in the joint Select Board School Committee meeting last week that there was discussion that there was going to be some costing available for different scenarios at that location available potentially this week. Is that, has that become available? And if so, do we know what it is?
Well,
I can take no for an answer if I have to.
Allison Steinfeld, Planning Director. Those costs were made available to the town today. They will be uploaded to the Planning Department's website tomorrow morning.
So we can't know what those are at this time?
I don't have them right now on me. They were just submitted by the consultants today.
Thank you.
thank you. Yes, sir.
Mike Toffel, Precinct 8. So I'm pleased that the discussion so far has really predominantly been between the 108 and the 115. And really, I'm here just to speak against the 98. It hasn't been getting much air, which I'm hoping reflects its popularity in this room, because for sure, if you're not quite sure whether redesign would be necessary between the two higher figures, I think the odds are very high that redesign would be required with this somewhat arbitrary 10% cut. And I also just want to point out that we've had no real evidence that 10% is not arbitrary. It just seems like someone picked it out of the air. And I don't think that's how we should make decisions here. There's been lots of commissions, lots of boards, school committees, select board have all studied this. And I don't think we should just shortchange all the hard work that's gone on for what it would be an arbitrary cut and delay getting Driscoll going, which should be all of our priority. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Spiegel.
Yes, Stanley Spiegel, Precinct 2. A question was raised about what is lost if we go from 115 to 108. I'd like to key in on what my colleague Mark Levy said a few minutes ago. What could be lost if we go from 108 to 115? And that's the likelihood of the override passing. I can just see opponents saying, see, you're giving them a blank check. They wanted this, now they want that. There's no number in the override. Who knows where they'll stop? People respond to things like this. I think Mark Levy hit the nail on the head, and I think for the sake of the override passage, I hope we can keep it at 108, the number that people know and are probably content with. Anyway, it's just a crapshoot, but that's my sense.
Yes, sir.
Carlos Hidrojo, Precinct 14, Advisory Committee, but speaking for myself. We talked today about sort of how to reduce the price, and it was mentioned that it could be done through square footage. As a registered architect, I would also invite the idea that a peer review of the project could find some savings for adjacencies or how the building is put together, not only just materials and so forth. So there's more than just square footage. It's how the building necessarily fits together and how the spaces are located with respect to what their uses are. So a peer review, I think, would add just a couple of weeks delay and maybe $50,000, $60,000 expense, but would give us a lot of new information that we could use to evaluate the cost of this project.
Mr. Sandman.
So as a follow-up to my colleague, advisory committee
tell
colleague,
us who you are.
Mike Sandman, Chair of the Advisory Committee, Town Meeting Member, Precinct 3. As a follow-up to my colleague, Mr. Riviero, on the member of the who is also a member of the Advisory Committee. He discussed this with us at the Advisory Committee, and so I wanted understood that the Advisory Committee number of $108.8 million is partly there because, well, that was the number that was proposed to the voters, but it's also partly there because we had a registered architect who said to us, you know, with a peer review, there were rational things that you could do to squeeze the cost down by this much. That's what the number is there for. It's not an irrational number. It is most assuredly not picked out of thin air.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. My name is Adrienne Bowman. I'm from Precinct 16. We've been talking a lot about money, as we should be, and I was a strong supporter of the bundled package because it was one ask for the voters. My question, I guess, is for Mr. Lummis, that if you have recently met with MSBA, what are the numbers for Pierce looking like? Because when we started talking about the multi-site solution, Pierce came to the top as the most urgent need, and now we've, you know, Pierce is caught up, I understand that. But I'm curious, what are the numbers gonna look like when we have to ask again and again, because everybody who is supporting the Driscoll project is saying loud and clear that they will support whatever else needs to happen. And I am imagining that means beyond Pierce, because just the Pierce project and just the Driscoll project are not gonna fix the problem everywhere, specifically in South Brookline. So do we have numbers from MSBA
So the
on
question
Pierce?
is, what are the current projected costs of the Pierce project, I suppose giving effect to the state contribution?
So just in terms of where the Pierce project is right now, it is not even in the feasibility phase. So working with MSBA, there are many different phases that go that take a number of years. So let me just explain that quickly. We're in the eligibility phase, okay, which means we haven't even been approved into the feasibility phase. That will not happen until this, until late winter at the earliest. At that point, we won't actually enter the feasibility phase until almost a year from now, so next fall, okay? So we're very far from any design considerations, any project, any sort of cost estimates on that. The only, early estimate we had was, I think, from 2 years ago now during site selection, when HMFH was looking at, 9 different properties, or I think it was 13 different options. We can pull those numbers up for you. I don't have them at my fingertips, but at this point, and they also included, whether you're acquiring property. I mean, lots of different ideas, basically. But I just want to say, in terms of the MSBA process, we are not at this point anywhere near feasibility phase, let alone schematic design phase, which is where you actually set in the costs. So I'm sorry to have better information than that.
Thank you. Yes, sir. I've called on one more speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Dan Saltzman, Precinct 6. I just want to say I think that I understand where people are coming from with the money that we're talking about. It's real money. There's no question about that. But we're talking about essentially $2 a month to most people. Again, I understand this is real money. I know where everybody's coming from, but we've come this far. We're talking about a relatively small difference, and we're being told that if we try to get that number down, that this is going to turn into something that's going to cause further delays. We've been trying to do this for so long. We've come this far. I think we have to take that number and not argue this anymore. I support the motion that's in front of us, or the main motion.
All right, let's hear from Ms. McClellan, and then we'll go for the question.
I'll make it quick. Nicole McClellan, Town Meeting Member, Precinct 11. Just to piggyback off of what Mr. Saltzman said, if we continue to try to spend money to save money, we're going to keep doing this sort of on a never-ending cycle. It will also cost money if we delay the project. Superintendent Loomis said we would be looking at, rather than winter 2023, a move-in date of the fall of 2023. So that's additional cost and potentially additional inflation. So this doesn't exist in a vacuum. I would also just say one other point. All of our campaign materials to voters that has gotten a lot of support so far has been based on a worst case scenario, talk about risk mitigation, of $120 million project cost, just in case it ended up being that high. and we have not received pushback for that. So we're arguing about $2 a month for numbers that are already out there to voters and that have support. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we're all ready for the question at this point. The main motion before you is that of Mr. Ananian at the top of page 1 of the rose-colored supplement. It's an appropriation of $115,300,000, et cetera, for the Driscoll bonding. The first amendment, sure. Raise your hands if you want recorded votes on all. We have a few amendments and the main motion, so we'll have a recorded vote on all of them. The first motion will be an amendment by the Advisory Committee and the Board of Selectmen to change the amount from $115,300,000 to $108,800,000, and to add to the motion the words, including the evaluation of the feasibility of providing office space for district-wide staff of the Brookline Public Schools in the 6th line of the motion. We will then proceed to Mr. Friedman's motion to reduce the amount from whatever you decide in the first amendment to $98 million. We'll then wind up with a main motion that has either been amended or not, depending upon how your votes come out on those two amendments. And we will then vote on that, and it requires a 2/3 vote. So the this is the, let's call it the Advisory Committee Amendment, Article 4 Advisory Committee Amendment, to change the amount and add that language. Okay. Hit 1 if you agree with those amendments, 2 if you're opposed, and 3 if you're abstaining. Yes, we're voting on the Advisory Committee's amendment to reduce the amount of the appropriation and to add the language that I just read to you. 2 amendments to the main motion. This requires only a majority vote. Motion fails by a vote of 84 in favor, 136 opposed, and 3 abstentions. The next motion is that of Mr. Friedman to reduce the amount, which is now $115,300,000, to $98 million. This is Friedman Amendment. Friedman Amendment, F-R-I-E-D-M-A-N. So hit 1. Press 1 if you favor reducing the amount of the appropriation from $115,300,000 to $98 million. Press 2 if you're opposed, and press 3 if you abstain. Motion fails by a vote of 25 in favor, 190 opposed, and 8 abstentions. On the main motion, which is now unamended, in the words of the motion at the top of the page 1 of the rose-colored supplement, this requires a 2/3 vote. This is Article 4 main motion. If you're in favor of the main motion as unamended, press 1. If you're opposed, press 2. And 3 if you abstain. Motion carries by a vote of 203 in favor, 13 opposed, and 10 abstentions. One of the remarkable things about that vote is there are 226 of you out of 248 who have stuck it out this evening. We proceed now to Article 6. The motion under Article 6 is on page 6-7, that the town adopt a resolution to provide for annual stipends to the Board of Selectmen, moved by Ms. McClellan, seconded by Mr. Wyszynski, Mr. McClellan. Ms. McClellan and Mr. Wyszynski share the podium for 8 minutes.
Good evening, Neil Wyszynski, Town Meeting Member, Precinct 5. Article 6 is a non-binding resolution which is asking for a sense of town meeting on the question of whether there should be an adjustment to the Select Board pay, which is now $4,500 a year for the chair and $3,500 a year for other members. This warrant article really asks the broader question: what kind of town government do we want? As you know, Brookline is the largest town in the Commonwealth with an over $300 million budget. And while all town meeting members here tonight are volunteers, and while some of you, especially my colleagues on the advisory committee, for whom I'm not speaking, spend many hours on town business, the buck doesn't stop with you, the buck stops with the Select Board. As you know, I was on the board for 6 years, 4 of them as chair. In addition to the hours spent on the job, and yes, it's a job, there were times I felt the weight of the town on my shoulders. I lost a lot of sleep, I got calls in the middle of the night, my hair got grayer, perhaps sooner and grayer than it would have otherwise. I was expected to represent the town before the media, the state legislature, other governmental entities, at civic celebrations and at funerals. The board makes operational decisions involving every resident of the town, millions of dollars, hundreds of employees, and businesses. It's a big, complicated job. Looking at the history of what is now a stipend, there were 2 times that the stipend was reset in a major way. In 1916, the chair was paid $2,500, which was the equivalent of just under $60,000 of current money. And 32 years later, in 1948, the chair's stipend was raised to $3,500, or about $37,000 in current dollars. After 1948, the stipend was unchanged for, get this, 63 years, when in 2011, we granted the board an additional $1,000 to their current levels. Well, maybe we should be a city, but we're not. And that isn't the question before us. But I say to you that leadership in a town this big, this complicated, and yes, this demanding is too important to be a hobby. It's too important to rely on what are essentially volunteers for our political and policy leadership. And frankly, it's unfair to the job holders. This lack of compensation guarantees one thing and one thing only, that the only people who can take the job are those who can afford to work long, high-stress hours with little pay. Is that the kind of town government we want? Is that the kind of town government we need? And now Nicole McClellan will discuss other reasons to vote favorable action.
Nicole McClelland, Town Meeting Member Precinct 11. Thank you to Neil Wyshynski and Mariah Nobrega, my co-petitioners on this article. In addition to professionalizing the board, the other goal of this article is providing modest compensation to our select board to remove one of the barriers to entry at the executive level of town government. So I would suggest, think about it this way. Think of a job posting that lists a bunch of job requirements: leadership skills, commitment to public service, strong communication skills, ability to build consensus, willingness to sit through 6 hours of meetings every Tuesday night, etc. Imagine this is a really important job. It affects about 60,000 people every single day. And then imagine in bold the last bullet point of the job requirement is must be able to work 20 to 30 hours per week year-round for free. How many people would that automatically eliminate from the candidate pool? A lot. And who specifically? The people that I think would be eliminated most by that are the people whose voices we most need and most lack in town government. People who are currently underrepresented and have been since the inception of this town. People whom we committed with the unanimous passage of Article 29 in May to do a better job, including in town government. So who has historically not been equally represented at the executive level in Brookline? People of color, women, parents of young children, low-income earners, to name a few. I would say, yes, we have had women on the select board, but it's important to note, if you look at the data of the last 20 years of the candidates that have run for select board, fewer than half of them have been women compared to men. We are making what I would call very limited steps towards racial diversity on the select board, but having one African man and one Latino man on the board for all of Brookline's 314 years of history does not mean we get to check that box and say, oh, okay, we're good now, we're there. We have made virtually no progress in terms of economic diversity. 1/3 of Brookline residents live below the 300% poverty threshold, which is a marker for economic insecurity. Those residents have likely never been represented on the board by someone from their constituency. Modestly compensating this position will pave the way for a broader and more diverse candidate pool and for more contested elections, which are a hallmark of a thriving democracy. I will say the criticism I've heard the most about this is that $40,000 or $60,000 is sort of a throwaway amount, and certainly not enough to make a difference for somebody. The only thing I could think of to say to that at first is, what? I would say if you're sitting in your seat thinking the same thing, I would encourage you to zoom out from your individual life. Zoom out from this auditorium. Imagine sort of doing a flyover of all of Brookline. People who live in public housing. People working one full-time job and one side job to be able to afford to stay here and send their kids to school here. Single parents who have to pay for childcare every time they want to show up to a meeting at town hall. Paraprofessionals, teachers, hourly wage earners, stay-at-home parents, working parents paying for daycare, people paying for elder care, social workers, people who work in nonprofits, etc. If you find yourself dismissing $40,000 or $60,000 as a negligible amount, as an amount that wouldn't make a difference for someone, know that you are likely already overrepresented in this room. And know that if you care about moving towards a truer, more representative democracy, it is your responsibility not to defend the status quo and to say it worked okay for you, but to pave the way for others who are not in the room and who are not usually at that table. Finally, for context, the total annual compensation outlined in this resolution amounts to $220,000 a year. We spent $225,000 this year on a pool water filter for the aquatic center. We have $200,000 allocated for garage floor sealants on concrete garages. I'm not saying these are not important in their own right, but if we can pony up $225,000 for a pool filter, we should be able to find $220,000 to help open up our democracy to more people, to reasonably compensate the executive board of this town, who are responsible for countless important decisions that affect our town every single day and for decades to come. Please join me in taking a real, actionable step towards a government that is more representative and inclusive by voting yes on warrant Article 6. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Doughty.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Dennis Doughty, Town Meeting Member Precinct 3, speaking for the Advisory Committee. The Advisory Committee expressed considerable agreement with the petitioner's characterization of many of the problems with our volunteer select board, but by a roughly 2-to-1 margin, we did not support the provisions of warrant Article 6. There were 4 primary reasons expressed. Number 1, as proposed, this is inequitable. There are many boards and commissions which rely on heavy volunteer commitment. What makes the select board so different? The petitioners argue that the select board is considerably more demanding from a time perspective and requires participants to assume personal risks that are not absorbed by members of other committees. And while that is true to an extent, the commitments required by the school committee or the ZBA are onerous as well, and the advisory committee thought it unwise to draw these distinctions. Number 2, this proposal is a quite speculative way to increase economic diversity on the select board. It's an interesting idea, but it's nowhere near enough money to substantively change the incentives around running for the select board. Campaigning is expensive and is almost certainly going to become more so if the position becomes more highly compensated. Can we presume that the people that we want to attract will find it economically feasible to mount an increasingly expensive campaign, especially because there's no guarantee they'll actually win? And if childcare or transportation costs are serious obstacles to participation on the select board, and there is reason to think that they are, why not find a mechanism to reimburse for those legitimate expenses incurred in the course of official duties, rather than merely providing a blanket stipend, which could represent a windfall for many participants on the select board? 3, if the concern here is that the select board is undercompensated for what is essentially a full-time political job, is it reasonable to compensate someone at only $40,000 annually? And if we're not willing to provide a higher compensation, can we predict reasonably that these increased stipends will change fundamentally who is attracted to the position? And how would we measure if we had been successful? Petitioners did offer some anecdotal evidence that parents of small children who currently feel excluded from the select board would be attracted, but have failed to articulate a distinction between the select board and the school committee with respect to how the school committee manages to attract parents and the select board doesn't, although both place rigorous demands on participation. And finally, isn't this really the charter question that Neil mentioned? In other words, isn't this an end run towards turning Brookline into a city or towards changing the organizational structure such that instead of a town administrator, Brookline has a town manager? And while there was support on the advisory committee towards exploring that possibility, there was much antipathy towards using this warrant article as a means towards that end. And so by a vote of 9 in favor, 16 opposed, and 2 abstentions, the advisory committee recommends no action on warrant Article 6.
Ms. Khan? And Ms. Frawley, you might as well have a seat. We're going to go through about 4 more speakers before I take questions from the floor.
Thank you. Janice Khan, Town Meeting Member from Precinct 15. I am opposed to warrant Article 6 for one simple reason. This warrant article is simply not ready for a vote, and here's why. Of the 351 municipalities in Massachusetts, 35 have representative town meeting forms of government. Last week, I contacted nearly half of those municipalities, and here's what I found. The average stipend is $3,000 for a chair and $2,600 for members. Brookline stipends are $4,500 and $3,500 respectively, above average. And that doesn't factor in 6 of the 16 towns I spoke with, including Lexington and Wellesley, that offer no compensation whatsoever. A 10-fold increase in compensation is way out of scale, as proposed in this article. It turns out that Danvers is also going through a select board stipend analysis and found that a stipend $5,000 or greater triggers pension eligibility. So they are keeping their stipends below $5,000. And I thought that was interesting. And yesterday I contacted the HR director to find out more. My inquiry ended up at the retirement board for a response. This afternoon I spoke with the director of the retirement board, who confirmed that any stipend $5,000 or greater would enable a select board member to be pension eligible. I also learned that until today, no one had asked him the question, which is why it is important to do a deeper dig, a deeper analysis before we move forward with this sort of warrant article. And this is what I learned. It takes 10 years in state or local municipal government to vest a pension. But then Director Zecca described a scenario that gave me pause. So you don't have to work in one place in order to reach that 10-year mark. You can do it in several places. So imagine a person who has 7 or 8 or 9 years of municipal service and then decides to run for select board and is elected to a 3-year term. The 10 years is reached, the pension is vested, and the town of Brookline acquires a lifetime pension obligation. Now, I don't think the petitioners had that scenario in mind, but it could be a very expensive unintended consequence for the town. And unlike health benefits, from which we could exempt select board members, the pension is a state system beyond our local control. So for that reason alone, we should vote against warrant Article 6. We simply don't know enough. Some might argue that, that we should become a city, but having spent a lot of time in Newton City Hall, I can tell you that it's no panacea. Importantly, it would take away our form of government, which through 240 town meeting members gives greater voice to the residents of this town than they would have under a city charter. But there may be a better course for Brookline. And it's been mentioned before, as I called the various towns, I also asked about their town manager form of government. Half the towns, including Needham, Arlington, and Lexington, have a representative town meeting form of government and a town manager who typically is able to exercise greater authority than a town administrator. Town manager acts have many commonalities and also unique differences. Brookline could define the role to meet our particular management needs. What we need is a charter commission. This is Newton's Charter Commission report from 2017. Importantly, a town manager with greater authority would strengthen the town's professional leadership with a high level of certainty. Right now, who serves on the select board is largely dependent on chance, who decides to run and who voters decide to elect. And I discovered that our town administrator's compensation is already in line with the highest paid town managers in Massachusetts, a clear indication that the role may need to be upgraded. Former town administrator Dick Leary, who died last year, began working in Brookline in 1960 as our executive secretary. The League of Women Voters of Brookline studied that role and found that the responsibilities required were equal to that of a town administrator. Brookline leaders agreed. In 1985, Dick Leary was appointed Brookline's first town administrator. It's time for Brookline to take another clear-eyed look at its leadership needs, initiate a charter commission study, consider upgrading the position of town administrator to a town manager with greater authority so we could preserve our form of government. If this article passes, Brookline will pay a total of $440,000 a year for a town administrator position with limited authority and select board members with limited municipal experience running a town. Brookline has much more critical uses for the nearly $250,000 per year proposed in this article. All you have to do is look at the current warrant, which has big ideas that are going to need additional staff to bring them to fruition. I urge you to vote no on warrant Article 6. We need to get this right for Brookline. and this issue needs serious additional study. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Nobrega. And Ms. Cates, would you come forward, please?
Mariah Nobrega, town meeting member from Precinct 4 and Advisory, not speaking on behalf of Advisory, speaking in support of Warrant Article 6, on which I am also a co-petitioner. Last spring, I brought Warrant Article 29 to you, which sought to engage you all as town meeting members in the hard work of bringing the principles of diversity and inclusion to bear on the membership of town meeting. That warrant article passed 165 to 1. Here's one of the therefore clauses you supported. Therefore, be it resolved that town meeting members should encourage and support residents who belong to one or more underrepresented groups to run for town meeting and or to apply to serve on town commissions, committees, and boards so as to build inclusion in town elected and appointed bodies with the goal of town meeting and town commissions, committees, and boards more closely reflecting the community. Here's the thing. The resolution we voted for last spring is directly related to this warrant article. Voting in favor of a stipend for the select board allows us to see more socioeconomically diverse participation on a key board which has historically been dominated by white-collar professionals and independently wealthy people. Voting in favor of a stipend for the select board allows parents of young children to at least not lose money on their participation. Raise your hands if you have paid a babysitter to attend any kind of meeting in the past. Look around right now. Now imagine doing that for multiple meetings a week, plus some day and morning hours for at least 3 years. And we wonder why women who are typically primary caregivers have been underrepresented as candidates. I have privately heard from people in this room, that if this warrant article passes, they could consider running for select board, whereas previously it was a financial impossibility for them. That's exactly what's going on here. Lower the barriers to entry to make participation possible and manageable for people who haven't historically been at the table. I wish Advisory had supported this warrant article. It was close, and the subcommittee was unanimously in support. But let's face it, AC isn't exactly your go-to committee on progressive issues. I'm a member. Can I say that? I said it. You know who is? The Brookline Commission for Women, who voted in support. The Commission for Diversity, Inclusion, and Community Relations, who voted in support. PACS voted in support. I want to close by quoting Raul Fernandez, who was just profiled in an article this week about his work on inclusion and diversity. What he said was, who we have in power affects what our policies and practices look like. This is why we care. Diversity is not just window dressing. Thank you, Raul. If you care about who we have in power and want the people at the table to my right to look and think and feel more like the town, you can't just wish for it to happen. You have to make changes and investments. Warrant Article 6 is one step toward our larger shared commitment to diversity and inclusion. I urge you to vote favorable action.
Thank you, Ms. Cates. And Ms. Vanderzeel, would you please come forward?
Beth Cates, town meeting member, Precinct 9. Article 6 comes before us during a heated and contentious town meeting that threatens to last 5 long nights. It comes in a
Try
year...
6.
Happy holidays. It comes in a year during which town meetings lasted almost into the next day, and an emergency town meeting had to be called in order to bid on the Newbury College property because the matter couldn't wait. In the last 3 days, there have been a flurry of email complaints about the burden that unpredictable and late adjournment hours place on members of town meeting. It has been suggested that 2 more town meetings be added to the 2020 calendar in order to keep up with the torrent of legislation addressing serious issues facing our town. Is this not a red flag? Brookline struggles with racial and sexual discrimination and harassment in its institutions. It seems unable to control real estate development, to ensure livable neighborhoods and create affordable housing. Brookline Public Schools have been struggling to accommodate the growth in student population and to develop an educational philosophy and curriculum that supports teachers and represents the values of the community. Brookline Town Government appears to lack the vision to maximize opportunities on the new frontier of the cannabis industry and the foresight to mitigate the ebb and flow of issues arising from it. Not all of these issues are the responsibility of the Select Board, but this is evidence that our town government is broken. Warrant Article 6 hopes to somehow address these issues by increasing compensation to the Select Board and to attract candidates that are not able to essentially donate their time. It states that the Select Board obligations require at least 20 hours a week, the equivalent of a part-time job. Governing a town of nearly 60,000 residents and growing is not a part-time job. It seems ironic that there is a presidential candidate touting his credentials as the mayor of South Bend, Indiana, population 100,000, not much larger than Brookline. Brookline needs a full-time government with elected officials whose sole job it is to govern, and they should be compensated accordingly. Only a few of the cities and towns referenced in the supporting materials for this article operate under a Select Board town meeting model. The Select Board town meeting model cannot address the issues facing Brookline in a transparent, decisive, and timely manner. We cannot just pay the Select Board more and hope that will solve our problems. Brookline has outgrown town meeting. It is not a rural or even suburban community. It is immersed in the growing metropolis that is Greater Boston. Brookline needs to change its form of government. Vote no on Article 6, and let's explore creating a new government that will embrace our future. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Vanderzeel. And Ms. Levine, would you come forward, please?
Kaya Vanderzeel, Town Meeting Member for Precinct 15 and member of the Commission for Diversity, Inclusion, and Community Relations. I'm speaking on behalf of the Commission. This is, of course, a resolution to increase the pay of the Select Board members in the hope of attracting people who usually can't serve due to monetary concerns. The issues of equity, listening to voices of people who usually are not heard in town meeting, talking about what $40,000 might mean to somebody who typically cannot serve. This has all been covered already, and I don't need to cover it again. So we, the Commission for Diversity, Inclusion, and Community Relations voted favorable action on this warrant article, 6-0 to 2, with two abstentions. We hope that you will consider doing the same.
Thank you, Ms. Levine.
Megan Levine, Town Meeting Member, Precinct 3. This is my first time addressing this body, so if you are all awake after my remarks conclude, I will consider it a success. So I had a chance to speak with a few of our town leaders before speaking for this article. One elected town leader told me that she's spent, or they have spent, upwards of $15,000 of their own money on childcare because of additional responsibilities to the town just this year. I imagine this leader ran for office because they wanted to serve and they knew they could figure out how to make childcare or the extra costs work. Or maybe, like our own Senator Elizabeth Warren, they had an Aunt B to call on. This article is for all our current and future elected leaders who don't have an Aunt B and just can't make it work. We're missing their voices of young parents, low-income folks, single women, caregivers, and many more. And in turn, we're missing their lived experience and all they can add to our town. Let's invest in our leadership. Please vote yes on Article 6.
Thank you, Ms. Frawley.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Regina Frawley from Precinct 16. I was at a meeting last week. It ran till 1:45 in the morning, I believe. And one of the select people said, the majority of us have full-time jobs, we need to go home. nothing in this article would make them have less of a full-time job. They're not going to have any more hours in the day. They're not going to be able to give more. And it isn't the solution to what many are thinking is the problem. And Dennis Doty and Janice Kahn had a great summary of the issues, one of which is it isn't needing the money to be in public office, it's to run for public office. And while there's social media, et cetera, it still doesn't, many of these people have not participated in a real hard election. It's very costly. So I oppose very strongly this article.
Ms. Scotto?
Barbara Scotto, Town Meeting Member, Precinct 8, and member of the school committee. While I support raising the pay for the people who serve in town, I'd like to give us some perspective. I think we are thinking too high. If you were working as a para in the Brookline schools and you were working for 1,323 hours per year, you might be making $18 an hour, which would give you a yearly salary of $24,814. If you were making $20 an hour, you would be being paid $26,000. And if you were making $25 an hour, you would be paid $33,000, or approximately $33,000. This is just some perspective. These people are working full-time jobs and being paid much less than we are thinking about paying people in town who have other jobs in many cases. And I understand we want to bring some diversity into our town meeting, but we also need to think about the people who work for the town and how we're going to increase their salaries. It is a big concern of the school committee. And I'm not speaking for the school committee, I'm speaking personally. I just think we need some perspective. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Bob Miller, Precinct 8. 3 quick points. One is, I don't think that the pitiful pay of paras is a basis for making a judgment. Number 2, I think that the historical numbers show that, you know, this was not an out-of-line figure in the past. And my last point is that, it is late. Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Keith Duclos, Precinct 7. It's my first time speaking, so please bear with me. I opened up the warrant articles. I saw the pay increase. My reaction was, you got to be kidding me. Select board, do something. I've been on town meeting for 6 years. I have been in town for 25 years. And we can't get a school. We can't get a school built. We can't resolve our overcrowding. If people want to raise, do something. Okay? I only get raises when I meet my obligations, when I perform. Okay? But with that said, I also recognize that it's very few people who can make the commitment to be able to be a member of the select board. And that this may give opportunities for other perspectives, views, and potentially resolving our ninth school issue, our overcrowding issue. And I also want to recognize that it's not only the select board that has the responsibility of getting the school issue resolved that we haven't resolved in over 10 years. It's all of us, and it's the school committee. But I also think that I would be in favor of this if it were not that we're struggling with the schools, and if it were not that we're going to continually be asking for overrides from all the citizens of town. That how can we give ourselves a raise and say we're broke and we need more money? My understanding is that we have a $3.5 million deficit in the school department this upcoming year. How can we say we have enough money to give raises, but we don't have enough money for the schools? and for our kids.
Thank you, Mr. Levy.
Mark Levy, Precinct 7. I've heard some very interesting arguments tonight against these raise. Most of them don't make any sense to me. The argument that, for instance, the selectmen should not get a raise because the school committee should have a raise too, just doesn't follow logically. There's no reason why you can't have one and then do the other, or do one and not do the other. You know, it just doesn't make sense. Also, the argument that we should not do the raise because we should go to a city charter or some other form of charter, or may have a stronger town administrator, town manager position. Again, that makes no sense. It's a non sequitur. A current board either should have a raise or not have a raise. The charter argument is another argument entirely. Doesn't really speak to this issue. And finally, I think I'll just leave with my good old-fashioned comment that you shall not muzzle the ox that threshes the grain. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Van Scoyoc.
John Van Scoyoc, town meeting member, Precinct 13, and member of the notoriously non-progressive advisory committee. Thank you, Mariah, my colleague. we love each other, right? We really do. And Neil, I'll say the same about Neil. And I'm not just joking. I'm going to try to give Mark Levy something that maybe is a good reason to not vote for this article. And it comes down to this. Look around you. Look at this body of volunteers, unpaid, some of them hiring childcare to be here tonight, some of them spending many hours preparing for tonight. The spirit of volunteerism is not something to be underestimated or taken lightly. It's the heart and soul of our government. It's the heart and soul of why we come here, why we do this. And this is just the town meeting. I'm kind of strange, if you don't mind my saying so. I've been spending a lot of time at town hall these days. I only serve on one committee, the advisory committee, but I monitor the select board when I can. I monitor the school committee when I can. I monitor the zoning board of appeals when I can. I monitor the planning board when I can. I'm not trying to get credit for myself. I'm trying to tell you, if you have never spent time visiting town hall frequently in the evening, you have no idea of how much volunteer activity goes on day in and day out. There are meetings at 7:30 in the morning of volunteer committees. There are meetings at 4 o'clock in the afternoon of volunteer committees. Meetings into the evening of volunteer committees. It is spread throughout our government. And the select board are part of that. But they actually get a stipend. Most of these boards and volunteers don't. The school committee accounts for 37% of our departmental expenses. The municipal departments, overseen by the select board, and they do oversee the schools too, but the municipal departments constitute 23% of our departmental budgets. If you could run for the select board and get paid $40,000 a year, or run for the school committee, which has responsibility over even more money, and get nothing, what would you probably do? Who's going to run for school? What is this proposal going to do in terms of the people who are willing to run for the other offices? That's just one question that hasn't been analyzed
by the sponsors. And the final thing I want to say, and I realize I've taken too much time already.
Yep.
Was that Sandy? Thank you, Sandy. We have a problem of diversity and inclusion in this town. I think everybody agrees on that. I think everybody agrees on that. But we can't let articles that are brought to us on behalf of, oh, my latest bright idea to do something about diversity and inclusion, to simply be adopted on that basis. They require analysis, deep analysis. Janice Kahn, God bless her, she did an amazing analysis of this proposal. The kind of analysis that, I'm sorry to say, should have been done by the sponsors. It should have been done by the sponsors. It should have been done by the select board. Well, it was done by the advisory committee, yay for us. We've got to take analysis seriously and not just vote because something has a brand. And I'm afraid this has been brought to us with a brand and not with the analysis that it needed. And so that's why the advisory committee is opposed to it, and I'm opposed to it.
Thank you. I've called on one further. Go ahead.
Hi, Shira Fisher, Precinct 11. Just a question one of the previous commenters made me think of. We do have some elected positions that are paid, including town clerk and constable. How much do the constables make?
No clue.
Oh, absolutely nothing. In fact, to be one, it costs money. You have to get
Could someone who
license,
works
et
for
cetera.
some town official answer that? Because I understand it's a paid position and that's what's reported in the newspaper. I understand that, but it's...
Well, wait a minute now. She's in the middle of a presentation. I'll take your motion for the question after she concludes. Go ahead.
According to the newspaper, the constable is a paid position, but it doesn't say how much, so I wanted to clarify how much constables are paid. I understand it's per number of things delivered. Do we know how much the town pays the constables?
Mr. Gordon?
Yeah, Neil Gordon, Precinct 1 Town Meeting Member, Brookline Constable. For a town-wide posting in 16 precincts, constables are paid $5 per posting. $80 we otherwise get paid for private service, for attorneys or other court service.
So how much does the town pay the constables over the course of the year?
Nothing.
The town pays for its town-wide postings?
No. The town pays you nothing for just being a constable. Is
The
that
town
correct?
the town pays nothing for just being a constable. We're paid for
Thank you.
service.
But you're paid for service. Thank you.
All right, I'll take a motion for the
Can
question.
I have one point of privilege just to correct part of the record that's incorrect?
Go ahead, Ms. McClellan.
Nicole McClellan, town
Then
meeting
can
member,
I please
Precinct 11.
take a motion for the
It's
question?
incorrect that there was no analysis done. An analysis should not be based on other municipalities that necessarily are small towns, which is what you're going to get if you're looking at other municipalities that have the same structure of government. What we looked at, which is a much more apples to apples comparison, are Brookline's peer communities based on revenue and population. You cannot compare us to a town of 10,000 people and say they don't pay their select board, so we shouldn't pay ours. If you want to know the numbers compared to our peer communities, they pay their executive an average per capita of $4.41. So amortized over all the people in town, $4.41 per capita for Brookline's peer communities. We pay ours 36 cents per capita. So that's the comparison. The analysis was done, and it shows that we are far below all of Brookline's peer communities in terms of revenue and population.
I'll take a motion for the question. Yes, is there a second? Okay. You see who's at the microphones. I have no one else signed up to speak. On the motion for the question, those in favor of the question, terminating debate, please raise your hands. Those opposed, motion carries by a 2/3 vote. Recorded vote? Sure. I mean, are there 35 town meeting members that want a recorded vote? Yes, I guess so. Okay, we'll deal first with the amendment adding the town moderator to the motion before you. Oh, I'm sorry, I was just dreaming. Article 6, main motion. I give up. This is on the motion on page 6-7. If you vote in favor, press 1. Opposed, press 2. Abstain, press 3. The motion fails by a vote of 100 in favor, 101 opposed,
Mr. I'm
and
so
13
sorry.
abstentions.
No. David Lowe took my vote recorder, so I don't have it. So my
I'm
vote's
sorry?
not up there. My vote's yes, but I can't record it because I don't have my recorder. Because somebody took it.
Well, Ms. McClellan has obeyed the rule and come forward immediately after a vote to record the misrecording of her vote. And that means the vote is 101 to 101 to 13. Motion fails.
Mr. Moderator,
Yes.
over here, just a clarification on process. If someone else comes forward in the next little bit affirming that their vote also was missed or miscounted, is that an opportunity for them to clarify it and you will correct the vote?
Yes.
Okay, I just want to be sure that that's
Yeah,
what's
as long as I can correct the vote within the, before town meeting dissolves.
before town meeting dissolves.
Yes.
Or before we're dissolved, or before we adjourn tonight. I just want to get clarification.
All right, it's past 10:30, and I will take a motion to adjourn
Mr.
town meeting
Moderator?
until tomorrow evening at 7 o'clock. All those in favor of adjourning, please say aye. Those opposed, no. Town meeting is adjourned until tomorrow at 7 p.m.